Hello everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I still can't shake what happened that day. It was 3 weeks ago, maybe a month now. Time kind of blurs together when something like this messes with your head. I keep telling myself I should just forget about it, move on, but every time I close my eyes, I see those dark eyes staring right through me. So I just picked up this new Glock 19 from Murphy's gun shop in downtown Naples. Been saving up for months, and I was excited as hell to finally have my own piece. The guy at the shop recommended I break it in properly, get a feel for the trigger and sight alignment before I really needed it. Made sense to me. I remembered this old service clearing out in Keir County that my buddy Jake had shown me a couple years back. It's one of those spots that used to be for power line maintenance or something, but they abandoned it. Just a roughly circular patch of cleared land, maybe 40 yards across, surrounded by thick Florida pines and palmetto scrub. Perfect for some target practice without bothering anyone or breaking any laws. The drive out there took about 25 minutes from my place. I remember the radio was playing some classic rock station, and I was drumming my fingers on the steering wheel, thinking about how good it was going to feel to finally shoot my own gun instead of borrowing someone else's at the range. The afternoon sun was getting lower, probably around 5:30 or so, but there was still plenty of light left. When I pulled into the clearing, I did a quick scan around just to make sure I was alone. Old habit from hunting with my dad when I was younger. Always check your surroundings. Everything looked normal. Just pines, saw palmettos, and that thick undergrowth Florida's famous for. The air was still and humid, typical for late fall down here. No breeze at all. I parked my truck near the edge of the clearing and grabbed my range bag from the passenger seat. Had my ear protection, a few boxes of 9mm, and a handful of empty beer cans I'd been saving for targets. Set the cans up in a nice, neat row about 20 yards out, maybe a little less. Close enough to hit consistently, but far enough to actually practice. Loading that first magazine felt good. There's something satisfying about the weight of a fully loaded gun in your hands, especially when it's yours. I put on my ear protection, those big over-ear ones that really muffle everything, and took my stance. The grip felt perfect, exactly what I'd hoped for when I held it in the shop. First shot took the can on the left, clean off its stump. Second one too. I was grinning like an idiot, probably talking to myself even though I couldn't hear my own voice through the hearing protection. The Glock was shooting exactly where I aimed it. By the time I'd emptied that first magazine, I'd knocked down 4 out of 6 cans. Not bad for a new gun. I lowered the pistol and turned back toward my truck to grab the second magazine I'd loaded. That's when it happened. That moment when your whole body just knows something's wrong before your brain catches up. You know that feeling? Like when you're walking alone at night and suddenly every nerve in your body is screaming at you to run, even though you haven't seen or heard anything yet? It was like a cold wave washing over me, starting at the base of my skull and spreading down through my shoulders and arms. My stomach dropped like I was on a roller coaster. I stopped moving, magazine halfway out of my range bag, and just stood there for what felt like forever but was probably only 2 or 3 seconds. Then I turned around. Jesus Christ, I'll never forget that moment as long as I live. There it was. Maybe 20 feet away, standing behind this big pine tree. Not completely behind it, more like it was using the tree as partial cover, the way a person might peek around a corner. But this thing wasn't a person. First thing I noticed was how tall it was. I'm 5'10", and this thing had to be close to 7 feet, maybe a little less. But it wasn't just tall, it was broad too, with shoulders that looked like they belonged on a linebacker. The whole thing was covered in this dark brown hair, not fur exactly, but coarse hair that looked matted and tangled, like it had been rolling around in the brush. The face, though, that's what really got to me. It wasn't human, but it wasn't like any animal I'd ever seen either. The skin was this greyish colour, like old leather that's been left out in the sun too long. The forehead stuck out heavy over these dark, dark eyes that were looking right at me, not looking around the clearing or scanning for threats, looking directly at me like it knew exactly what I was and what I was doing there. Those arms were all wrong. Too long, hanging down past where human arms should end, with hands that looked massive even from that distance. The whole thing was built like it could tear a car apart without breaking a sweat. We stared at each other for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, and my mouth went completely dry. The gun was still in my right hand, but I couldn't make myself lift it. Not because I was being noble or anything like that. I physically could not make my arm move. It was like my whole body had just shut down. Then it made this sound. I still had my hearing protection on, but I heard it anyway, felt it more than heard it really. This deep, low grunt that seemed to come from somewhere in its chest. And I swear to God I felt it vibrate in my own chest, like standing too close to a big speaker. It wasn't angry exactly, but it definitely wasn't friendly. More like a warning, like a dog telling you to back off without actually barking yet. That's when the really scary part hit me. This thing, whatever the hell it was, had gotten to within 20 feet of me without making a sound. The ground in that clearing was covered with pine needles and dead leaves, the kind of stuff that crunches and crackles when you step on it. I'd heard myself walking around setting up the cans, but this thing had moved through all of that without so much as a whisper. How does something that big move that quietly? How does something with feet that size not break every stick and leaf between wherever it came from and where I was standing? I started backing toward my truck, trying not to make any sudden movements. Kept the gun in my hand, but pointed down. Didn't want to do anything that might seem threatening. My legs felt like rubber, and I kept expecting to trip over something or fall on my ass. But somehow I made it to the driver's door. The whole time, those dark eyes never left me. It didn't move from behind that tree, didn't follow me or try to circle around or anything like that. Just watched me with this kind of patient intelligence that was somehow worse than if it had been snarling and acting aggressive. I reached behind me and found the door handle, yanked it open, and practically threw myself into the driver's seat. Slammed the door and immediately hit the locks, which I know was stupid because what good are car door locks going to do against something like that? But it was pure instinct. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely get the key in the ignition. Kept looking through the windshield at that pine tree, expecting to see it charging toward me or circling around to the passenger side. But when I finally got the engine started and looked up, it was gone. Just gone. No sound, no movement in the brush, no rustling of leaves or snapping of branches. 1 second it was there, and the next second it wasn't, like it had just evaporated. I sat there with the engine running, probably for 5 full minutes, staring at that tree and the space around it. My hands were still shaking and I could taste copper in my mouth. Must have bitten my tongue at some point without realizing it. The hearing protection was still on my head, making everything sound muffled and distant. Finally, I managed to pull myself together enough to back out of that clearing and get the hell out of there. Left my beer cans where they were, didn't even think about collecting my brass. Just wanted to put as much distance between me and that place as possible. The drive home was a blur. I kept checking my mirrors, kept expecting to see something running through the trees alongside the road, or standing in the middle of the asphalt behind me. My heart didn't slow down until I was back in actual civilization, passing houses and strip malls and traffic lights. When I got home, I sat in my driveway for another 10 minutes before I could make myself get out of the truck. Kept thinking about those eyes, about how it had moved without sound, about that deep grunt that I'd felt in my bones. I haven't been back to that clearing. Hell, I haven't been target shooting anywhere since then. The Glock is sitting in my safe, still loaded with that second magazine. Every time I think about taking it out and going to a proper range, I remember standing there with a loaded gun in my hand, feeling completely helpless. I've tried to rationalize it, told myself it was probably just someone in a costume playing a prank, or maybe my mind playing tricks on me in the fading light. But I know what I saw, I know what I felt, and I know that whatever was behind that tree was not human. The worst part isn't even the fear, though that's bad enough. The worst part is the questions that I can't answer. What was it doing there? How long had it been watching me before I noticed it? If I hadn't turned around when I did, what would have happened? And why do I keep thinking about going back? I dream about it sometimes. Not nightmares exactly, but these weird dreams where I'm back in that clearing. But this time I don't have the gun, and this time it's not hiding behind a tree. It's just standing there in the open, waiting for me. And in the dream, I walk toward it, instead of backing away. I always wake up before I get close enough to see its face clearly. It's been 3 weeks, maybe a month, and I still jump at shadows. Still check my locks twice before bed. Still find myself scanning the tree line when I'm driving through any wooded area. I haven't told anyone about this. Who would believe it? And honestly, I'm not sure I want anyone to believe it. Because if it's real, if what I saw was actually out there, then that changes everything. It means there are things in those woods that we don't know about, don't understand. Things that can move without sound and watch us without us knowing. Things with dark eyes and 2 long arms that grunt warnings in frequencies that vibrate in your chest. I keep telling myself I should forget about it, move on with my life. But I can't shake the feeling that it's not over, that whatever I saw that day is still out there, maybe still watching, maybe waiting. And the really terrifying part of me wants to go back and find out. Story 2. I've been putting off writing this for over a decade now. Every time I sit down to type it out, my hands start shaking and I have to get up and walk around for a while. But people keep asking me about what happened out there, and I figure maybe getting it all down will help me make sense of it, or at least help me sleep better at night. This whole thing started on March 11th, 2012. I remember the exact date because it was my buddy's birthday weekend, and we'd planned this camping trip to Bear Island in the Big Cypress Preserve just outside Naples. I'd been going to that same spot for years. It's one of those places where you can really get away from everything. No cell service, no road noise, just you and the swamp. We'd set up camp that afternoon, got a good fire going, and spent the evening just talking and drinking beer. Nothing fancy, just the kind of relaxing weekend you need when work's been kicking your ass. My friend had crashed around 11:30, but I was still wired, couldn't sleep. The fire was burning low, so I figured I'd let it die down naturally and just sit there for a while longer. It was a clear night, no moon, but you could see every star in the sky once your eyes adjusted. The preserve gets completely dark out there, darker than most people ever experience. I'm talking about the kind of darkness where you can't see your own hand in front of your face if you're not near the fire. Around midnight, maybe a little after, I realized I'd left my phone in the Jeep. I know. What did I need my phone for with no service? But I wanted to check the time, and I had this habit of setting an alarm even when camping. Old work routine, I guess. The Jeep was parked maybe 40 yards from our campsite, just far enough that I'd have to walk through a patch of complete darkness to get there. I should have grabbed a flashlight, but the fire was still throwing enough light that I could see the general direction, and I figured I'd be fine. I'm 6'6", been camping and hunting since I was a kid. A quick walk to the truck didn't seem like a big deal. I stepped away from the fire and immediately felt that disorientation you get when your night vision hasn't kicked in yet. Everything was just black shapes and shadows, but I kept walking in the direction where I knew the Jeep was parked, feeling my way with my feet, trying not to trip over any roots or stumps. I'd made it maybe halfway when I stopped. Something felt wrong. You know that feeling when you're alone in the dark and suddenly you're not sure you're alone anymore. It's like every nerve in your body starts screaming at you to pay attention. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds, just listening. The swamp at night isn't quiet. There's always something making noise. Frogs, insects, things moving in the water. But right then, everything had gone completely silent. And I mean completely. No frogs, no bugs, nothing. Like someone had just turned off the sound in a movie. That's when I saw them. 2 eyes, glowing yellow in the darkness, maybe 12 or 15 feet away from me. At first I thought it might be a reflection from the fire, but the fire was behind me, and these eyes were glowing on their own, like they had their own light source inside them. The thing that really got my attention was the height. I'm 6'6", and these eyes were right at my level. Not below like a dog or a panther, not above like something in a tree. Right at eye level, which meant whatever I was looking at was about my height, maybe a little taller. We stared at each other for what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds. I couldn't see anything else about whatever it was. No outline, no shape, nothing. Just those 2 yellow eyes floating in the darkness, completely motionless. Then the smell hit me. Jesus Christ, the smell. It came at me like a wall, so strong and sudden that I actually took a step backward. Imagine the worst skunk smell you've ever encountered. Mix it with wet dog that's been rolling in garbage, and then make it 10 times stronger. It was so thick I could taste it, and it made my eyes water immediately. That smell snapped me out of my frozen state. I turned and ran back toward the fire as fast as I could, stumbling over roots and branches, not caring if I fell on my face. All I wanted was to get back to the light and my friend. I must have made enough noise crashing through the brush, because my buddy was sitting up in his sleeping bag when I got back to camp, asking what the hell was going on. I was breathing hard, probably looked like I'd seen a ghost, which I guess in a way I had. I told him what happened, and to his credit, he didn't laugh or tell me I was seeing things. He just grabbed the big spotlight we kept for emergencies and said we should go check it out together. That's the kind of friend you want when something weird happens. We walked back toward where I'd seen the eyes, with him holding the spotlight and sweeping it back and forth. The beam was powerful enough to light up a good 50 yards in any direction, but we didn't see anything. No eyes, no animal, nothing that shouldn't be there. Even the smell was gone, like it had never existed. But here's the thing that bothered me. My friend kept the light moving, scanning all around, but I found myself staring at the exact spot where I'd seen those eyes. And even though there was nothing there, I had this overwhelming feeling that we were being watched. Like whatever it was had just stepped back a few feet and was standing there in the darkness outside the reach of our light. We stayed out there for maybe 10 minutes, walking around, checking behind trees and bushes. Found my phone in the Jeep, which seemed stupid now compared to what had just happened. Finally went back to camp, but I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those yellow eyes staring back at me. The next morning we looked around in the daylight for any sign of what I'd encountered. No tracks, no disturbed vegetation, nothing. It was like the whole thing had been a dream, except I knew it wasn't. I couldn't stop thinking about it after we got back home. For weeks I kept telling people about it, trying to figure out what I'd seen. Most people just nodded politely and changed the subject, but a few suggested it might have been a black bear or a panther. The problem with that theory was the height of those eyes and the fact that they were glowing on their own, not reflecting light. By late April, I'd convinced myself that I needed to go back. I kept thinking about what I'd always said, that if I ever encountered something strange in the woods, I'd investigate it properly instead of just running away. Well, here was my chance to put that to the test. I talked my friend into another camping trip to the same spot on April 28th. This time we brought more equipment, better flashlights, a camera, even a tape recorder in case we heard any strange sounds. I felt more prepared, more in control of the situation. The first night was completely normal. We set up camp in the same area, got a fire going, had a few beers. Nothing unusual happened, and I started to think maybe I'd imagined the whole thing back in March. The second night, April 29th, was different. We were sitting around the fire, probably around 10:30 or 11, when I got this crazy idea. I'd been reading about people who claimed they could communicate with Bigfoot by making vocalizations, and I thought, what the hell, let's give it a try. Worst case scenario, we'd feel stupid for howling at the swamp. I stood up, cupped my hands around my mouth, and let out the longest, loudest howl I could manage. It echoed across the preserve, bouncing off the trees and fading into the distance. My friend started laughing, saying I sounded like a dying coyote. Then something answered. The response came immediately, from the same general direction where I'd seen the eyes back in March. But this wasn't an echo of my howl. This was something completely different. It was deep, much deeper than any human voice, and it had this quality that I can't really describe. Not quite animal, but not human either. It lasted maybe 3 or 4 seconds, and when it ended, the entire swamp went quiet again. My friend stopped laughing. We looked at each other, and I could see in his face that he'd heard the same thing I had. This wasn't my imagination, or some story I was making up. Something out there had responded to my call. I was about to try howling again when he grabbed my arm and shook his head. He had this look on his face like he'd just realized we might be in over our heads. Smart man. We decided to call it a night and get into our tents. I brought the camera and one of the flashlights into my tent, figuring if anything happened I'd at least try to document it. But honestly, I was starting to have second thoughts about the whole investigation idea. I'd been lying there for maybe an hour, not really sleeping but not fully awake either, when I heard it. The crash came from right behind our tents, maybe 10 feet away at most. It sounded like someone had taken a tree trunk and slammed it against something hard. Not the crack of a branch breaking. This was a solid, violent impact that shook the ground. I was instantly wide awake, heart pounding. Then I heard the footsteps, heavy footsteps, moving slowly around the outside of our campsite. Not the quick, light steps of a deer or the shuffling of a bear. These were deliberate, measured steps, like something large was walking upright and taking its time to circle our tents. That smell came back too, that same combination of skunk and wet dog, and something else I couldn't identify. It was so strong it seemed to seep right through the tent fabric. I heard my friend's daughter whisper from their tent, "Dad, do you smell that? Smells like skunk." She was maybe 8 years old at the time, and she sounded scared but trying to be brave. We all just lay there, not moving, barely breathing. The footsteps continued for what felt like forever, sometimes stopping for long periods where we'd hear nothing but that horrible silence, then starting up again. Whatever was out there was taking its time, like it was studying our campsite, figuring out what we were. Then, as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. The footsteps, the smell, everything. The normal night sounds of the swamp gradually came back. Frogs croaking, insects chirping, but none of us moved or said anything until the sun came up. When we finally got out of our tents the next morning, we looked for any sign of what had been walking around our camp. There might have been some disturbed ground behind where my tent had been, but it was hard to tell, and then it started raining. Within an hour, any tracks or evidence that might have existed were washed away. We packed up and left that morning. Nobody talked much on the drive home. That was over 10 years ago now, and I still can't explain what happened out there. I've been back to Big Cypress since then, but never to that particular spot on Bear Island. Something about it just doesn't feel right anymore. The thing that bothers me the most isn't what I saw or heard. It's that feeling of being studied, like whatever was out there both nights was intelligent enough to watch us, to respond when called, to wait and see what we do. That's not animal behavior. Animals don't play games with campers or take their time walking around tents just to see how people will react. I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night, thinking I can smell that combination of skunk and wet dog. And every time I'm alone in the woods, I catch myself listening for footsteps that are too heavy and too deliberate to belong to anything I learned about in school. The worst part is knowing that I called it. I stood up that night and howled into the darkness, and something howled back. Something that was waiting for me to make contact. Something that's probably still out there, waiting for the next person brave enough or stupid enough to call out into the night. Story 3. I've never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Not my parents, not my wife, not even a therapist. Every time I try to put it into words, I start shaking and have to stop. But it's been eating at me for years now, and I figured maybe writing it down might help me finally make sense of what we experienced out there. This was late fall. I can't remember the exact date, but it was definitely getting cold at night. Me and 2 of my buddies had decided to spend the weekend at my dad's old trailer out on James Road in Naples. The place had been sitting empty for months after my dad moved into town, and we thought it would be fun to hang out there, drink some beer, maybe do some fishing in the morning. The trailer was one of those old aluminum jobs from the 70s. Nothing fancy, but it had electricity and running water. It sat on about 3 acres of mostly wooded land, with the backside facing directly into a thick patch of Florida scrub and pine trees. You couldn't see any neighbors from there. It was isolated enough that you could make as much noise as you wanted without bothering anyone. We'd gotten there around 5 in the afternoon, unloaded our stuff, and spent the evening just hanging out like we used to do in high school. Playing cards, telling stories, the usual stuff. By around 10 o'clock, we were all pretty relaxed and maybe a little buzzed from the beer we'd been drinking. That's when we heard the first howl. It came from somewhere in the woods behind the trailer, long and drawn out, almost like a wolf, but deeper. Louder, too. At first, we just looked at each other and laughed about it. One of my friends said it was probably just a coyote, and we went back to our card game. But then it happened again, maybe 5 minutes later. Same long howl, but this time it seemed to come from a different direction, maybe off to the left side of the trailer. That got our attention. We stepped outside onto the little wooden deck my dad had built and listened. The night was clear and still, not much wind, and you could hear everything: frogs, insects, things moving around in the brush. Normal night sounds for Florida. Then my buddy, the one who'd said it was a coyote, decided to howl back. Just for fun, you know. He cupped his hands around his mouth and let out this long, ridiculous howl that probably sounded more like a dying cat than anything else. We were all cracking up. But something howled back immediately. And it wasn't coming from the same place as before. This one was off to the right side, and it was answered by another howl from straight ahead in the woods. Then another one from the left. That's when we stopped laughing. We stood there on that deck, listening to these howls going back and forth between different spots in the trees, and it slowly dawned on us that we weren't hearing echoes or just one animal. These were distinct voices coming from different locations, like they were having some kind of conversation with each other, and we were right in the middle of it. My friend tried howling one more time, but his heart wasn't in it. His voice cracked halfway through, and when the howls answered back, now from at least 4 different directions, we decided it was time to go inside. We locked the door and sat back down at the kitchen table, but nobody was interested in cards anymore. We kept looking toward the windows, listening for more sounds from outside. For maybe 10 minutes, everything was quiet, except for the normal night noises. Then the rocks started hitting the trailer. The first one hit the wall near the kitchen with a metallic thunk that made us all jump. Then another one, then another, then small rocks or pebbles. Nothing that would do any damage, but they were definitely being thrown at the trailer from outside. We turned off the lights and tried to look out the windows, but it was too dark to see anything. The throwing continued for maybe 5 minutes, rocks hitting the walls, the roof, bouncing off the windows. It felt like we were under siege by invisible attackers. Then we heard the footsteps, heavy footsteps, walking slowly around the trailer, maybe 30 feet away. Not the quick, light steps you'd expect from deer or even a person trying to sneak around. These were deliberate, measured steps, like something large was taking its time to circle the trailer. That's when the grunting started. Low, deep grunts that didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. They weren't quite animal sounds, but they weren't human either. Something in between, like a person trying to imitate an animal or an animal trying to sound human. It made the hair on my arms stand up. My friends looked at me like I was supposed to know what to do. It was my dad's trailer, so somehow that made me responsible for handling whatever was happening outside. But I was just as scared as they were. The grunting got closer, and the footsteps seemed to be right outside now, maybe 10 feet from the trailer. We could hear whatever it was moving through the brush, snapping small branches and rustling leaves as it walked. That's when we all ran for my dad's bedroom. I don't know why we picked that room specifically, except that it was at the back of the trailer facing the woods, and somehow that felt like the safest place to be. Maybe we figured if something was going to happen, we wanted to see it coming. We crowded into that little room and sat on the bed, barely breathing. The footsteps continued outside, but now they seemed to be moving all around the trailer, like whatever was out there was doing a complete circuit of the building. Then the knocking started. Slow, deliberate knocks on the walls, spaced maybe 10 seconds apart. Not frantic pounding, but measured, patient knocks, like someone was testing the walls to see how sturdy they were. The knocks would come from one side of the trailer, then stop, then start up on another side a minute later. The whole time, that unnatural silence had settled over everything outside. No frogs, no insects, no night sounds at all. Just those methodical knocks and the occasional grunt. We sat there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. None of us said a word. We just listened to whatever was outside making its circuit of the trailer, knocking on the walls, grunting softly. Finally, one of my friends whispered that someone should look outside and see what was out there. They both looked at me, and I realized they wanted me to do it. My dad's bedroom had these old aluminum blinds that were always kind of bent and didn't close completely. I could see thin lines of moonlight coming through the gaps. Very slowly, very carefully, I got up from the bed and moved toward the window. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the blind. I found the cord and adjusted it so I could peek through just a tiny crack, maybe half an inch wide. I put my eye up to the gap and tried to see what was outside. At first, I couldn't make out anything, just dark shapes that could have been trees or bushes or shadows. The moon was bright enough to cast some light, but everything looked unfamiliar and threatening. Then I saw movement. Something was standing maybe 15 feet from the window, perfectly still, facing the trailer. At first, I thought it was a person because it was upright and roughly human-shaped. But as my eyes adjusted, I could see it was too tall, too broad across the shoulders. And then the most terrifying thing happened. As I was looking at this figure through the tiny gap in the blinds, it moved, but it moved in perfect synchronization with my own movements. When I shifted slightly to get a better angle, it shifted too. When I leaned a little closer to the window, it leaned forward. For just a moment, my brain tried to convince me that I was looking at my own reflection in the glass. But I knew that wasn't possible. The angle was wrong, the lighting was wrong, and this thing was clearly outside, not inside with me. It was mimicking me perfectly. I let go of the blind cord like it was on fire and stumbled backward toward the bed. My friends asked what I'd seen, and I lied. I told them it was just my reflection in the glass, nothing to worry about. But I knew that wasn't true. I sat there on the edge of the bed for maybe 5 minutes, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. Maybe it had been my reflection after all. Maybe the fear and adrenaline had made me see things that weren't there. Finally, I worked up the courage to look again. This time, when I peered through the blinds, there was nothing. Just shadows and the silhouettes of palm trees swaying slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel inside the trailer. But the absence of anything outside was almost worse than seeing the figure, because now I didn't know where it had gone, or if it was still out there, just outside my field of vision. The knocking had stopped. The grunting had stopped. Even the footsteps had stopped. Everything was completely quiet, except for the gradual return of normal night sounds. Frogs starting to croak again, insects beginning to chirp. But I knew it wasn't over. For the rest of that night, I lay awake on my dad's bed with my two friends, listening to sounds that came and went like waves. Soft grunting that would start up for a few minutes, then fade away. The occasional creak of the trailer settling, which might have been normal or might have been something pressing against the walls. The worst part wasn't what I could hear. It was what I could feel, this overwhelming sense of being watched, of something patient and intelligent waiting just outside. The trailer felt like it was made of paper, like the thin aluminum walls wouldn't stop anything that really wanted to get inside. I kept thinking about how that figure had moved in perfect sync with my movements, how it had known exactly when and how I was looking at it, and had responded accordingly. That wasn't animal behavior. That was something else entirely. Around 4 in the morning, one of my friends started crying. Not loud sobbing, just quiet tears rolling down his face. The other one was making this low humming sound under his breath, like he was trying to calm himself down. I wasn't doing much better. I had to keep swallowing to keep from throwing up. We never talked about leaving. Somehow we all understood that going outside, even to get to the car, wasn't an option. Whatever was out there was waiting for us to open that door. When the sun finally came up, the spell was broken. The normal daytime sounds of birds and traffic in the distance made everything seem normal again. We packed our stuff and left without saying much to each other. We've never been back to that trailer. Hell, we barely talked about what happened that night for years afterward. When we did bring it up, it was always in vague terms. That weird night at your dad's place, or remember when we got spooked camping. But I think about it all the time. Especially that moment when I looked through the blinds and saw something looking back at me, matching my every movement perfectly. Like it was studying me, learning how I moved, how I reacted. The trailer's been empty ever since. My dad eventually sold the land to a developer, and I heard they tore the whole thing down. Part of me was relieved when I heard that news, but part of me wonders what the construction crew found when they cleared those woods. And sometimes, late at night when I can't sleep, I wonder if whatever was out there that night is still around somewhere, still watching, still learning, still waiting for someone to open the door. Story 4. I'm a field biologist, been working in South Florida ecosystems for over 20 years now. I've seen a lot of weird stuff out in the swamps and wetlands, things that don't make it into the research papers or field guides, but what happened along the Fucker Union Canal is something I still can't explain, and it's been eating at me for years. This was maybe 8 or 9 years ago, during one of my regular surveys in the area between Route 41 and Turner River Road. I was working with a colleague. Good guy, solid researcher, not the type to see things that aren't there. We'd been doing water quality assessments and wildlife counts in that stretch of canal system, routine stuff I'd done hundreds of times before. It was late morning, probably around 10:30 or 11, and we were walking along one of the maintenance trails that runs parallel to the canal. The weather was typical for that time of year, hot, humid, with that thick Florida air that makes your shirt stick to your back within minutes of leaving an air-conditioned vehicle. We'd been walking for maybe 20 minutes, taking notes on water levels and vegetation patterns when I saw them. A pair of legs, crossing the trail, maybe 50 yards ahead of us. At first glance, I thought it might be someone else working in the area, a park ranger, or maybe another researcher. But as we got closer, I realized these legs were all wrong. Too long, too thick, covered in coarse brown hair that was clearly visible even from that distance. The legs moved with this deliberate, unhurried pace that wasn't quite human and wasn't quite animal either. They crossed from the left side of the trail to the right, disappearing into the thick vegetation on the canal side. The whole crossing took maybe 3 or 4 seconds, but it felt like everything had slowed down. I stopped walking and just stared at the spot where I'd seen them disappear. My colleague kept walking for a few more steps before he realized I wasn't beside him anymore. He turned around and looked at me, then followed my gaze toward the vegetation. We stood there for maybe 30 seconds, not saying anything. The normal sounds of the swamp, birds, insects, water lapping against the canal banks, seemed muffled somehow, like we were hearing them through cotton. Then the vegetation started moving, not swaying in the breeze. There wasn't any breeze that morning. This was deliberate movement, like something large was pushing through the sawgrass and cattails on the other side of the trail. We could hear it too, a rustling, crackling sound of stems being bent and broken. That's when my colleague leaned over and whispered, "Did you see that?" I nodded, not trusting my voice. We both knew we'd seen the same thing, but neither of us wanted to be the first one to say what we thought it was. The movement in the vegetation continued for maybe another minute, getting fainter as whatever was causing it moved away from the trail toward the canal. Then everything went quiet again, but it was that unnatural kind of quiet that makes your skin crawl. We backed away slowly, not taking our eyes off the spot where the legs had crossed. Didn't run, didn't panic, just gradually put distance between ourselves and that section of trail until we felt safe enough to turn around and head back to our vehicle. The drive back to the office was awkward. We talked about water samples and data collection, professional stuff, but we were both thinking about those legs. Finally, as we were pulling into the parking lot, my colleague said, "That was probably just someone in waders doing maintenance work." And I agreed with him, even though we both knew that wasn't what we'd seen. But here's the thing about being a scientist. You can't just leave something unexplained. It bothers you, keeps nagging at the back of your mind until you have to go back and investigate. So over the next few months, I found myself returning to that area again and again, sometimes for legitimate research purposes, sometimes just to satisfy my own curiosity. And I started finding things. The first discovery was about 2 weeks after our initial sighting. I was doing a solo survey in the same general area when I came across these flattened areas in the sawgrass, maybe a quarter mile from where we'd seen the legs cross the trail. These weren't random patches of bent grass. They were clearly defined circular areas, each one about 6 or 7 feet across. The grass was pressed down in a way that suggested something heavy had been lying there for an extended period. They looked like giant nests, and there were at least 4 of them clustered together in a small clearing. I took photos, made measurements, tried to think of natural explanations. Maybe alligators had been sunning themselves there, or wild hogs had bedded down, but the size was all wrong, and the pattern was too organized. Alligators don't make nests in sawgrass, and hogs would have left more evidence of rooting and foraging. That's when I found the hair. Caught on the broken stems around the flattened areas were tufts of coarse, dark hair. Not the fine fur of a deer or the bristles of a wild pig. This was thick, almost rope-like hair, dark brown to black in color. I collected several samples and took them back to the lab for analysis. The hair was unlike anything in our reference collection. Too coarse for most known mammals, wrong structure for primate hair, and definitely not from any domestic animals. The lab tech ran it through every database we had access to and came up empty. But the really disturbing discovery came a few weeks later. I was expanding my search area, following game trails and waterways to see how far the evidence extended. About a mile south of the original sighting location, I found bones. Black bear bones, scattered around a small clearing like the remnants of a picnic. But these weren't the normal remains you'd find from a natural death or even a predator kill. These bones had been broken open, snapped lengthwise to get at the marrow inside. I've seen what happens when scavengers get to a carcass, and I've seen the remains of animals killed by panthers or alligators. This was different. The bones were broken with incredible force, split cleanly in ways that would require enormous strength. Whatever had done this wasn't just eating. It was processing the bones systematically, efficiently. The skull was the worst part. It had been crushed, not bitten or clawed, but crushed like someone had squeezed it in their hands until it caved in. There were impressions in the bone fragments that looked almost like fingerprints, but scaled up to an impossible size. I reported the find to Fish and Wildlife, told them I'd discovered what appeared to be an unusual predation event. They sent someone out to look at it, but the official explanation was that the bear had probably been hit by a vehicle and scavengers had scattered the remains. Case closed. Except I knew that wasn't what had happened. The clearing where I found the bones was over a mile from the nearest road, and there were no signs of a vehicle impact on any of the bone fragments. By this point, I was spending most of my free time in that area, mapping the locations of hair samples, flattened grass areas, and bone fragments. A pattern was starting to emerge. All of the evidence was concentrated in a roughly triangular area bounded by the canal on one side and thick swampland on the other two sides. During my night surveys, I was doing water sampling for a separate project that required after-dark collection. I started hearing things, long, deep calls echoing across the water. At first I thought they might be alligator bellows, but the frequency was all wrong. These calls were lower, more sustained, with a complex tonal quality that reminded me of primate vocalizations. I'd spent 2 years doing research in Costa Rica, working with howler monkeys, and these calls had some similarities to howler vocalizations. But they were much more powerful, carrying across distances that would be impossible for even the largest howler monkey. And there are no native primates in Florida that could make sounds like that. The calls always came from across the canal, from the direction of the thick swampland where I'd been finding the physical evidence. They were sporadic, maybe 1 or 2 calls per night, always after full dark when the normal daytime sounds had died down. One night in particular stands out. It was late October, raining steadily, and I was working alone collecting crawfish samples along Turner River Road for a population study. The rain had been coming down for hours, turning the unpaved access road into a muddy mess. I was working my way along the canal bank with a headlamp and collection nets, focused on my sampling protocol, when I started noticing a pattern in the sounds around me. First, I'd hear something moving through the vegetation on the opposite bank, not the normal sounds of small animals or birds, but heavier movement, deliberate and measured. Then, a few minutes later, I'd catch a whiff of this strong chemical smell. Not quite natural gas, not quite sewage, but something in between that reminded me of methane mixed with organic decay. The smell would fade after a minute or two, and then I'd hear the movement again, but from a different location further along the bank. Then the smell would return, stronger than before. It took me almost an hour to realize what was happening. Whatever was over there was moving parallel to my position along the road, staying hidden in the thick vegetation, but keeping pace with me as I worked my way from one sampling site to the next. The pattern was consistent. Movement, smell, pause, movement, smell, pause, like something was tracking my progress and marking its territory as it went. The really terrifying moment came when I stopped to change the batteries in my headlamp. I'd been working for maybe 2 hours, and I was probably 1.5 miles from where I'd parked my truck. The rain had gotten heavier, and I was starting to think about calling it a night. I turned off my headlamp to save power while I fumbled with the battery compartment, and that's when I realized how alone I was. The rain was masking most sounds, and without my light, I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. But I could smell that chemical odor again, stronger than it had been all night, and I could hear something breathing. Not the quick, shallow breathing of a small animal, but deep, measured breaths coming from somewhere very close. too close. Maybe 20 or 30 feet away, on the same side of the road where I was standing. I got my headlamp working again and swept the beam across the area where I thought the breathing was coming from. Nothing there except palmetto scrub and pine trees. But the smell was overwhelming now, so strong it made my eyes water. I packed up my equipment as quickly as I could and started walking back toward my truck. The whole time, I had this feeling that I was being watched, that something was moving parallel to me through the trees, just outside the reach of my light. The breathing sounds continued, sometimes from one side of the road, sometimes from the other, always just close enough to hear, but far enough away that I couldn't pinpoint the exact location. When I finally reached my truck and got inside, I sat there for maybe 10 minutes with the engine running and the doors locked, trying to process what had just happened. The smell was gone, the breathing sounds had stopped, but I still felt like I was being observed. I've been back to that area many times since then, but never alone at night. During the day, I continue to find evidence, more hair samples, more flattened areas in the grass, more bones broken in ways that don't make sense according to any natural explanation. The calls across the water continue too, always after dark, always from the same general area. I've tried recording them, but the sounds don't translate well to digital audio. On the recordings, they just sound like distant thunder or maybe heavy machinery. What bothers me the most isn't what I've seen or heard, it's the systematic nature of it all. The evidence isn't random or scattered. It's organized, territorial, like something intelligent is managing that area of swampland for its own purposes. The pattern I noticed that night on Turner River Road wasn't coincidence. Something was escorting me, staying parallel to my position, letting me know it was there without showing itself. That takes intelligence and planning. I keep going back because I'm a scientist, and scientists are supposed to investigate unexplained phenomena. But honestly, part of me hopes I never find the complete answer to what's living in that stretch of swampland. Because based on the evidence I've collected over the years, I don't think I'd survive a face-to-face encounter with whatever made those brutally broken bones and those impossibly large tracks in the mud. Some questions are better left unanswered. Story 5. I've never been able to drive that stretch of the Tamiami Trail again without my hands getting sweaty on the steering wheel. It's been years now, but every time I pass that area, I roll up the windows and push the accelerator a little harder, like I'm trying to outrun a memory that's been chasing me ever since Hurricane Gustav. We'd left FIU around 4 in the morning, maybe 4:15. I remember checking my phone for the time when we loaded the boards into my buddy's truck. Hurricane Gustav had just passed through the Gulf, and we'd been tracking the swell reports all week. The storm had stirred up some serious waves along the Gulf Coast, and we weren't about to miss it. There were 4 of us crammed into that old Ford pickup, me, 2 of my roommates, and this guy from our marine biology program who knew all the best surf spots between Miami and Naples. The plan was simple. Drive west on the Tamiami Trail, hit a few beaches along the way, and spend the day chasing whatever waves Gustav had left behind. The drive started out normal enough. Dark highways, gas station coffee, that excited energy you get when you're 19 and chasing swells at dawn. We had the windows down, music playing, talking about where we wanted to surf first. The air was still thick and humid from the storm, but it felt clean, electric, like something big had just passed through and left the world changed. By the time we hit the really remote stretch of the trail, that long, straight section where there's nothing but sawgrass and cypress on both sides for miles, the sun was starting to think about coming up. Not full daylight yet, but that grey pre-dawn light where you can just start to make out shapes in the landscape. I was in the passenger seat, half asleep against the window, when something caught my eye off to the right side of the road. At first I thought it might be a dead tree, or maybe a fence post, just a dark, vertical shape, standing in the low field, maybe 300 yards from the highway. But as we got closer, something about it bothered me. The proportions were wrong, and it was too isolated, too perfectly positioned to be natural. I sat up straighter and really focused on it. That's when I realized it wasn't a tree or a post at all. It was a figure, standing perfectly still in the middle of that empty field, maybe 20 yards from a cluster of palmetto bushes. Even from that distance, I could tell it was massive. Broad shoulders, thick torso, easily 7 feet tall or more. It was facing toward the road, toward our truck, like it had been watching traffic go by. The weird thing was how motionless it was. Not the casual stillness of a person taking a break, but the absolute frozen stillness of something that didn't want to be noticed, like a deer caught in headlights, except this thing wasn't startled or preparing to run. It was just waiting. I didn't say anything at first. Part of me thought maybe I was seeing things, that the early morning light was playing tricks on my eyes. But as we passed by, I kept looking back, and the figure never moved. Just stood there watching us drive away. We were probably another mile or two down the road when one of the guys in the back seat said something about wanting to check out this spot he'd heard about, some break near a boat ramp that might be working with the new swell. The driver started looking for a place to turn around. That's when I finally spoke up. I told them about the figure I'd seen standing in the field, described where it was, said maybe we should go back and check it out. I tried to sound casual about it, like I was just curious. But honestly, I was hoping someone else would see it too and confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. So we found a place to do a U-turn and headed back east, all of us scanning the right side of the highway for whatever I'd spotted. I was leaning forward in my seat, trying to remember exactly where the figure had been standing, looking for the palmetto cluster I'd used as a landmark. When we got to the right area, I pointed toward where I'd seen it. Right there, I said. It was standing right by those palmettos. But there was nothing there, just empty fields stretching away from the highway, sawgrass bending in the breeze, and that same cluster of palmetto bushes looking exactly like they had when we'd driven past the first time. No figure, no sign that anything had ever been standing there. The other guys looked where I was pointing, but I could tell they weren't seeing anything unusual. One of them joked that I needed more coffee, and another said maybe it had been a hunter or someone checking out storm damage. Reasonable explanations, but they didn't feel right. I asked the driver to pull over so I could get a better look. We stopped on the shoulder, and I got out of the truck. The first thing that hit me was the silence. After the noise of the highway and the truck engine, the sudden quiet was almost overwhelming. No birds, no insects, no wind through the grass. Just this heavy, expectant silence that made the hair on my arms stand up. Then the smell reached me. Jesus Christ, that smell. It came out of nowhere, like someone had just opened a door and let it out. The best way I can describe it is wet dog that's been rolling in rotten eggs, mixed with this sharp, acidic musk that burned the inside of my nose. But it wasn't the smell of something dead, roadkill or carrion that had been sitting in the sun. This was the smell of something alive, something wild and rank and wrong. The smell was so strong it made my eyes water. I actually took a step backward toward the truck, covering my nose with my shirt. It was like nothing I'd ever encountered, and I grew up in Florida. I'd smelled dead gators, rotting fish, all kinds of swamp decay. This was different, worse. I stood there on the shoulder of that empty highway, looking out at the field where I'd seen the figure, breathing that horrible smell through my shirt, and that's when the real terror hit me. Not the fear of seeing something I couldn't explain, that was unsettling, but manageable. The terror came from the absolute certainty that whatever I had seen was still out there, still watching me, hidden somewhere in that sea of grass, completely invisible, but aware of every move I made. It knew I had seen it. It knew I had convinced my friends to come back and look for it. And it had disappeared in the few minutes it took us to turn around, vanishing into that landscape without leaving a trace. without disturbing a single blade of grass. That level of awareness, of intelligence, of perfect camouflage, that's what made my hands start shaking. I climbed back into the truck, but I couldn't sit in the passenger seat anymore. Something about facing forward, about not being able to see that field, made me feel exposed and vulnerable. I crawled into the back seat and sat facing the rear window, watching that stretch of empty land until it disappeared behind us. My friends kept asking if I was okay, and I told them I was fine, just tired from getting up so early. But the truth was, I felt sick. Not physically sick, though the smell had been bad enough. I felt sick with the knowledge that something large and intelligent had been watching us from that field, and we had driven right past it without knowing. The rest of the drive to Naples was a blur. The other guys talked about surf conditions and which beaches to hit first, but I barely heard them. I kept thinking about that figure, about how perfectly still it had been, about how it had managed to disappear so completely in just a few minutes. But mostly, I kept thinking about that smell, and about the certainty that we were being observed by something that understood exactly what it was doing. We spent the day surfing, and it should have been epic. And Gustav had left behind some clean, powerful waves, exactly what we'd driven all that way to find. But I couldn't concentrate. Every time I was out in the lineup, sitting on my board between sets, I found myself scanning the shoreline, looking for dark shapes that didn't belong. The smell came back to me in waves throughout the day, triggered by nothing I could identify. I'd be paddling for a wave, and suddenly my nose would fill with that acidic animal musk, so vivid and real that I'd look around expecting to see something watching me from the beach. On the drive home that evening, we took a different route. Nobody suggested going back on the Tamiami Trail, and I didn't bring it up. I was relieved when we took the interstate instead, even though it added time to the trip. But here's the thing that still bothers me years later. When we'd stopped on the shoulder that morning, when I'd gotten out to look for the figure I'd seen, I'd been absolutely certain that whatever it was hadn't actually left the area. The smell, the unnatural silence, the feeling of being watched, all of that pointed to something still being there, just hidden, which meant it had been close enough to observe me standing on the highway, close enough to see me looking for it, to watch me react to its scent, to study my behavior and my fear. And it had chosen to remain hidden. That suggests a level of intelligence and self-control that's more disturbing than any physical description I could give. This wasn't just some animal that had wandered out into a field. This was something that understood concealment, that could assess threats and make calculated decisions about when to reveal itself and when to disappear. Even now, when I'm driving through any remote area of South Florida, I find myself scanning the landscape for dark shapes that don't quite fit. And sometimes, usually on humid mornings when the air is thick and still, I catch a whiff of something that reminds me of that morning on the trail. When that happens, my stomach drops and my hands get cold, exactly like they did when I was standing on that highway shoulder, breathing in the scent of something wild and wrong while it watched me from somewhere I couldn't see. I never found out what that smallest post office in the world landmark was supposed to be. We never made it that far before turning around. But I've always wondered if that figure in the field had been stationed there for a reason, if it knew that stretch of road was isolated enough that it could observe passing traffic without being disturbed. The most terrifying part isn't what I saw that morning. It's the knowledge that something saw me too, evaluated me, and decided I wasn't worth revealing itself to. Something that's probably still out there, still watching, still deciding who gets to see it and who just gets to catch a glimpse of movement in their peripheral vision before it vanishes back into the grass. Detail. Story 6. I was 12, maybe 13 years old when this happened, and even now, 30 years later, I can still smell that mixture of rot and wet animal that hit us in the swamp that day. People always ask me why I never moved away from Naples, why I stayed in the same neighborhood where I grew up. The truth is, I'm terrified to leave. Not because I love it here, but because I know what's out there in those wetlands, and at least here I can keep an eye on it. It was summer, probably late June or early July, one of those sweltering Florida days where the humidity makes your clothes stick to your skin the moment you step outside. School was out, and me, my younger brother, and our friend from down the street were doing what we always did when we were bored, exploring the swamp that stretched out behind our subdivision. Our neighborhood was one of those newer developments built right up against the edge of the Everglades, where the backyards of the last row of houses just dropped off into sawgrass and cypress trees. My parents were always telling us not to go too far back there, warning us about alligators and snakes and getting lost. But when you're 12 and 13, that kind of warning just sounds like a dare. We'd been back there dozens of times before, following the little game trails that crisscross through the brush, climbing trees, catching frogs and lizards. We thought we knew every inch of that swamp within a half-mile of the houses. That's why what we found that day was so shocking. It was in a spot we'd been through before, but somehow we'd never seen it. We were maybe a quarter mile from the nearest house, following this deer trail that wound between a couple of big cypress trees, when my brother stopped and pointed deeper into the swamp. "What the hell is that?" At first I couldn't see what he was looking at. The vegetation was thick, and the summer growth had made everything green and dense. But then I saw it, a geometric shape that definitely didn't belong in nature, partially hidden behind a stand of palmetto bushes. We pushed through the brush to get a closer look, and that's when we found it. It was a cage, but not like any cage I'd ever seen before. This thing was massive, probably 8 feet tall, maybe 6 feet wide and 10 feet deep. It was made of thick metal bars, the kind of heavy steel you'd use to build a bridge or something. The bars were spaced maybe 6 inches apart, close enough that nothing large could slip through, but wide enough that you could stick your arm inside. The whole thing was partially overgrown with vines and moss, like it had been there for years. But underneath the growth, the metal still looked solid, functional. This wasn't some abandoned piece of junk that had been dumped in the swamp. This was equipment. The door was on one end, a heavy gate that would swing shut and lock with this complicated mechanism involving springs and levers. Even at 12 years old, I could see how it was supposed to work. Something would trigger the mechanism from inside the cage, and the door would slam shut with enough force to keep whatever was inside from getting back out. But the really disturbing part was what was hanging in the back of the cage. A large piece of raw meat, maybe a quarter of a side of beef, was suspended from the ceiling of the cage on a thick metal hook. The meat was fresh enough that it was still red, still bleeding, but it had been there long enough to attract flies, lots of flies. The meat was positioned so that anything trying to get to it would have to go deep into the cage, far enough that when the door slammed shut, there would be no chance of escaping. My friend was the first one to say what we were all thinking. "It's a trap." We stood there staring at this thing for probably 5 minutes, trying to figure out what it was for. It was obviously designed to catch something, but what? The size suggested something big, bigger than a dog or even a person. The heavy construction suggested something strong, something that could bend normal metal if it got angry enough. That's when I made the stupidest decision of my life. I climbed inside. I don't know why I did it. Curiosity maybe, or just the kind of reckless bravado that gets 12-year-old boys killed. I squeezed between the bars of the door and walked into the cage, looking around at the mechanism, trying to figure out how the trigger worked. The smell hit me immediately. It wasn't just the smell of the raw meat or the flies. There was something else, something alive and organic and wrong. It was like mushrooms that had been rotting in water for weeks, mixed with the smell of a wet dog that had been rolling in garbage. The smell was so strong, it made my eyes water, and I had to breathe through my mouth to keep from gagging. That's when I noticed the scratches. The inside walls of the cage were covered in deep gouges, like something with very sharp claws had been trying to tear its way out. The scratches were too deep and too regular to have been made by any animal I knew about. They looked almost like claw marks, but scaled up to an impossible size. I was running my finger along one of the gouges when I heard my brother yell from outside the cage. "Get out of there! Now!" But before I could move, before I could even turn around, I heard it. The roar. It started low, so low I felt it in my chest before I actually heard it. Then it built, getting louder and deeper until it filled the entire swamp with this sound that was like nothing I'd ever heard before. It wasn't the roar of a gator or a panther or any animal I knew. It was deeper, more powerful, with a quality that sounded almost human, but definitely wasn't. The roar seemed to go on forever, echoing off the trees and bouncing back from different directions until it felt like we were surrounded by whatever was making that sound. I froze inside that cage, suddenly understanding exactly what it was for and exactly how much danger we were in. Someone had built this thing to catch something that could make a sound like that. Something big enough and strong enough to tear metal bars with its claws. Something that was apparently close enough to smell us, to know we were there, to be very unhappy about our presence. The roar finally ended, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. It was the kind of absolute quiet that means every living thing in the area has stopped moving, stopped breathing, stopped existing until the danger passes. That's when my brother started screaming at me to get out of the cage. I scrambled toward the door, but I was shaking so hard I could barely coordinate my movements. My hands were slipping on the metal bars, and I kept getting my shirt caught on the edges of the door frame. Behind me, I could hear the raw meat swinging on its hook, bumping against the back wall of the cage, with these wet, meaty sounds that made my stomach turn. I finally squeezed through the door and stumbled into the swamp grass, my legs barely supporting me. My brother and our friend were already backing away from the cage, their faces white with terror. That's when we heard the crashing. Something large was moving through the swamp toward us, and it wasn't being subtle about it. We could hear branches snapping, palmetto fronds rustling, the splash of something heavy moving through standing water. Whatever was coming was big, fast, and pissed off. We ran, but we'd only made it maybe 50 yards when I heard this sound like a freight train passing overhead. I looked up just in time to see a tree trunk, not a branch, but an entire tree trunk maybe 8 feet long and as thick as my body, flying through the air above us. The trunk crashed into a stand of palmetto bushes, maybe 10 feet ahead of where we were running, hitting with enough force to shake the ground under our feet. Palmetto fronds and chunks of bark exploded in all directions, and the trunk buried itself so deep in the soft swamp ground that only one end was still visible. If we'd been running just a little faster, if we'd been 10 feet further along the trail, that trunk would have crushed us. I tripped and fell face first into the swamp grass, cutting my arms and face on the sharp edges of the sawgrass. But I didn't stop to check the wounds or even to look back at what had thrown that tree trunk. I just got back up and kept running, following my brother and our friend as we crashed through the underbrush toward home. Behind us I could hear more crashing, more things being thrown or knocked over, but it seemed to be getting fainter, like whatever was back there had decided we weren't worth chasing anymore. We didn't stop running until we hit the edge of our subdivision, stumbling out of the swamp and onto the manicured grass of someone's backyard, muddy and scratched and bleeding, gasping for breath. The three of us stood there for maybe 5 minutes, bent over with our hands on our knees, trying to catch our breath and process what had just happened. None of us said anything. We were all too scared and too confused to put it into words. Finally, we walked back to my house, where my mum took one look at us and started demanding to know what had happened. We were covered in mud and grass stains, bleeding from a dozen small cuts, and probably looked like we'd been attacked by a lawnmower. I tried to explain about the cage, about the meat and the trigger mechanism, and the roar and the tree trunk that had nearly killed us. But even as I was saying it, I could see the expression on my mom's face changing from concern to skepticism, to that look parents get when they think their kids are making up stories for attention. She cleaned up our cuts and made us promise not to go back into the swamp alone. But I could tell she thought we'd just gotten spooked by an alligator or maybe a wild pig, and that our imaginations had turned it into something more dramatic. That night, I lay awake thinking about what we'd found back there. Someone had built that cage. Someone had put fresh meat in it as bait. Someone was trying to catch something that lived in that swamp, something big enough to require 8-foot steel bars and strong enough to claw deep gouges in metal. And that something had been close enough to us that it could have killed us with a thrown tree trunk if it had wanted to. Close enough to watch us exploring its trap, to smell us, to decide whether we were a threat worth eliminating. The most terrifying realization was that it had chosen not to kill us. That tree trunk hadn't been a miss. It had been a warning. Whatever threw it had been accurate enough to put it exactly where it wanted it. Close enough to scare us, but not close enough to actually hurt us. It had been herding us, driving us away from its territory and back toward the subdivision where we belonged. Over the next few weeks, I found myself constantly looking toward the swamp, wondering if that cage was still there, if someone was still baiting it, if something was still being hunted in those wetlands behind our neighborhood. I wanted to go back and look for the cage again, but I never worked up the courage. And after a couple of months, I convinced myself that maybe my mom had been right. Maybe we just scared ourselves with our imaginations and turned a normal encounter with swamp wildlife into something more sinister. But every now and then, usually late at night when the house was quiet, I'd hear something in the distance that sounded like that roar. Faint, so faint I couldn't be sure I wasn't imagining it, but deep and prolonged, and definitely not an alligator or a panther. When I hear that sound, even now, as an adult, I make sure all the doors are locked and all the windows are closed, because I know that somewhere out in that swamp, something is still being hunted. Something that's smart enough to recognize a trap, strong enough to tear through steel bars, and accurate enough to put a tree trunk wherever it wants it. Something that decided 30 years ago that 3 kids weren't worth killing, but I don't know if it would make the same decision today. Story 7. I've been a test driver for automotive companies for over 15 years now, based out of Naples, and I drive Alligator Alley at least twice a week as part of my regular routes. That stretch of Interstate 75 between Naples and Fort Lauderdale, it's probably the most boring, monotonous piece of highway in all of Florida. Just straight road cutting through the Everglades for miles and miles, nothing but sawgrass and the occasional canal on either side. When you drive the same route hundreds of times, you get into this zone where you're not really paying attention to the scenery anymore. You're focused on the vehicle performance, the instruments, the radio chatter with the other test drivers. The landscape just becomes background noise, something that flows past your peripheral vision without really registering. That's why what I saw that day hit me so hard, because in 15 years of driving that road, I thought I knew every mile marker, every canal bridge, every stand of cypress trees between Naples and Miami. I thought nothing could surprise me out there anymore. This was maybe 2 years ago, middle of a Tuesday afternoon. Perfect weather. Clear skies, good visibility, no wind. We were running a convoy test with 4 vehicles, checking some new stability systems at highway speeds. I was in the second car, following about 100 yards behind the lead vehicle with 2 more cars behind me, maintaining the same spacing. The radio chatter was routine stuff. Speed confirmations, system status reports, the usual back and forth between drivers and the engineers back at the facility. Professional, focused, boring. Just another day of data collection on Alligator Alley. I'd been driving for maybe 40 minutes. We were probably somewhere around mile marker 60 or 70 when something caught my eye off to the right side of the highway. At first, it was just movement in my peripheral vision, the kind of thing that might be a bird or a piece of trash blowing in the wind. But something about it made me turn my head for a better look, and that's when I saw it clearly. There was a clearing on the far side of the canal that runs parallel to the highway in that section, maybe 50 feet across, just an open patch where the trees had never grown back or had been cleared for some reason. And walking across that clearing, maybe 40 or 50 feet from the road, was something that definitely wasn't supposed to be there. It was tall, probably 7 feet or more, walking upright on two legs with this unhurried, deliberate pace. The thing that struck me immediately was how human-like its posture was. Completely erect, balanced, not the hunched-over gait you'd expect from a bear or the quick, nervous movement of a deer. But it definitely wasn't human. The whole thing was covered in hair. Thick, coarse hair that reminded me of coconut fiber, the brown, stringy stuff you see on the outside of coconuts at the grocery store. The color was this reddish-brown, like rust mixed with brown. And I could see there was a lighter patch on the chest area, almost cream-colored against the darker hair everywhere else. The arms were what really got my attention, though. They were long, much longer than human arms, and they swung back and forth as it walked with this natural rhythm that was both familiar and completely wrong at the same time. Like watching someone walk, but with the proportions all stretched out. The whole sighting lasted maybe 3 or 4 seconds. I was doing 70 miles per hour, so by the time my brain processed what I was seeing and I turned my head for a better look, I was already past the clearing. The thing didn't look toward the highway, didn't seem to notice the convoy of cars passing by. It just continued walking across that open space until it disappeared into the tree line on the far side. I immediately looked in my rearview mirror to see if the drivers behind me had noticed anything, but their cars were maintaining normal spacing and there was no chatter on the radio. As far as I could tell, I was the only one who had seen it. I didn't say anything on the radio. I don't know why. Maybe I was worried the engineers would think I was losing focus, or maybe I just needed time to process what I'd seen. In our business, you have to maintain credibility. If you start reporting strange sightings during test runs, people start questioning your reliability as a driver. So I kept quiet and tried to focus on the test parameters, but my mind kept going back to that clearing. The more I thought about it, the more details I remembered. The way it moved with complete confidence, like it belonged there. The thickness of its torso, much broader than a human but not bulky like a bear. The length of stride, covering ground efficiently without appearing to hurry. By the time we reached our turnaround point near Fort Lauderdale, I'd convinced myself that I needed to see that spot again. Maybe I'd been mistaken. Maybe it had been a person in unusual clothing or a trick of light and shadow that had made something normal look strange. During the return trip, I started paying closer attention to the landscape, trying to identify the clearing where I'd seen the figure. The problem with Alligator Alley is that mile after mile looks essentially the same. Canal on one side, sawgrass marsh on the other, occasional stands of trees. But I was pretty sure I could find the right spot based on some distinctive cypress trees I remembered seeing just before the sighting. When I thought we were getting close to the area, I eased off the accelerator slightly, just enough to create a little more distance between my car and the lead vehicle. Not enough to affect the test data, but enough to give me a few extra seconds to scan the landscape. Then I saw the clearing again. It was exactly as I remembered it, an open patch maybe 50 feet across, surrounded by trees on 3 sides with the canal forming the fourth boundary. The ground looked level and clear, with short grass that was a different color from the surrounding marsh vegetation. I slowed down even more as we passed the spot, studying it carefully for anything that might have created the illusion I'd experienced on the outbound trip. No fallen trees that could be mistaken for a large animal, no stumps or broken palm trunks that might cast unusual shadows, no maintenance equipment or vehicles parked in the area. Just an empty clearing with nothing moving in it except grass swaying slightly in the breeze. But here's the thing that really got to me. The clearing was positioned perfectly for concealment. It was set back far enough from the highway that most drivers wouldn't notice it unless they were specifically looking in that direction. The canal created a natural barrier that would discourage casual investigation, and the tree line provided immediate cover for anything that wanted to disappear quickly. If something wanted to cross from one side of that area to the other while remaining mostly hidden from highway traffic, that clearing would be the perfect route. Quick dash across the open space, then back into the safety of the trees on the far side. The more I thought about it during the rest of the drive back to Naples, the more unsettled I became. Not because of what I'd seen, but because of what it implied about how often this kind of thing might be happening without anyone noticing. I started doing the math in my head. On a typical day, maybe 1,000 vehicles pass through that section of Alligator Alley. Most drivers are focused straight ahead, watching for traffic, not scanning the landscape on either side of the highway. The ones who are looking around are usually passengers, not drivers, and they're often distracted by phones or conversations. How many times could something large cross that clearing, or any of the dozens of similar clearings along that stretch of highway, without being seen? How many times had I driven past the exact same spot over the years, at slightly different times of day, and missed seeing something by just a few seconds? That thought scared me more than the actual sighting had. When I got back to the facility that evening, I went online and started researching the area around that section of Interstate 75. What I found was disturbing. There were scattered reports going back years of drivers seeing unusual things along Alligator Alley. Large animals that didn't match known Florida wildlife, upright figures walking through the marsh, brief glimpses of something that disappeared too quickly to identify. Most of the reports were dismissed as misidentification of known animals or tricks of light and shadow. But when you plotted them on a map, there was a pattern. The sightings were clustered around specific areas where the highway passed close to deeper swampland, areas where something large could move around without much chance of human contact. Areas exactly like the clearing where I'd had my sighting. Over the next few months, I started paying closer attention during my regular runs on Alligator Alley. I didn't see anything else unusual, but I began to notice things I'd never paid attention to before. Game trails leading away from the highway into thick swamp, areas where the vegetation looked disturbed, like something large had passed through, spots where the normal bird and insect activity seemed muted, like the local wildlife was avoiding certain areas. The worst part was the feeling that I was being watched during some of these drives. Nothing I could point to specifically, no movement in the trees, no unusual sounds, no visual confirmation of anything out of place. Just this creeping sensation that something in that vast expanse of wetland was aware of my regular schedule, tracking my vehicle as it passed by twice a week. I started varying my routes when possible, taking alternate highways instead of Alligator Alley for some of my test runs, but eventually work requirements forced me back to that stretch of Interstate 75, and every time I passed that clearing, I found myself holding my breath and scanning the tree line. The clearing was always empty when I looked, but that didn't make me feel any safer because I knew now that something was out there, something that understood how to remain hidden, how to use the landscape to its advantage, how to cross from one safe area to another without being detected by the constant stream of traffic just a few dozen yards away. And I knew that my sighting had been pure chance. A matter of turning my head at exactly the right moment, looking in exactly the right direction, while something that had probably made that crossing hundreds of times before finally got caught in the open. The question that keeps me awake at night isn't what I saw that day. It's how many times that same figure had crossed that same clearing while I was driving past, focused on my instruments or my radio or the car ahead of me, completely unaware that something was watching me from 50 feet away. How many times had it seen me before I saw it? And what would have happened if it had noticed me noticing it? I still drive Alligator Alley twice a week. It's my job and I'm good at it. But I don't zone out anymore during those long, straight stretches through the Everglades. I keep my eyes moving, scanning the landscape, checking every clearing and every tree line, not because I want to see something again, but because I need to know if something is seeing me. Story 8. I've been carrying this story around for over 50 years now. And I still wake up some nights in a cold sweat, remembering that smell and those eyes staring at me from the darkness. It was May of 1973, and I was 22 years old, working construction with my dad down in South Florida. My dad had gotten us this side job through his boss, a guy who owned some property out near Boone Beach and needed drywall work done on 2 hunting cabins he was building in the early Everglades. It was supposed to be easy money, just a few days' work, putting up sheets and taping joints. The only catch was that the cabins were so far out in the sticks that we'd have to camp there overnight to make it worth the drive. Neither of us minded that part. My dad had been taking me hunting and camping since I was old enough to walk, and we both figured it would be nice to get away from the heat and traffic of the city for a few days. Plus, the boss was paying us double time for the inconvenience. The cabins were maybe 30 miles from the nearest paved road, connected by this sandy track that wound through palmetto scrub and pine flatwoods before eventually reaching a small clearing where someone had started construction on what would eventually be a hunting camp. The clearing was maybe an acre in size, with 2 small cabin frames sitting on concrete block foundations about 50 yards apart. When we got there that first morning, I could see why the boss needed help finishing the project. The framing was solid enough, but whoever had started the work had apparently given up after getting the roofs on and the basic structure in place. There were no doors, no windows, just openings where they would eventually go. The electrical was roughed in but not connected, and there was no plumbing at all, just a hand-pumped well between the 2 cabins. We spent the day working on the interior walls of the first cabin, measuring and cutting drywall sheets, getting them hung and ready for taping. It was hot, dusty work, but we made good progress. By late afternoon, we had 1 cabin nearly ready for the 2nd coat of mud. As evening approached, we set up our camp between the 2 cabins. My dad had brought a Coleman stove and some basic camping gear, but we decided to build a fire pit as well, mostly for the light and to keep any bugs away. The clearing was surrounded by thick woods on all sides, and once the sun went down, it got dark fast out there. That's when we first started noticing the sounds. At first, it was just the normal stuff you'd expect. Frogs starting their evening chorus, insects beginning to buzz, the occasional splash from what was probably a gator moving around in a pond we could hear but couldn't see through the trees. But as we were setting up the camp and getting our fire started, I began to pick up on other sounds that didn't quite fit. Branches snapping in the woods around us, but not the quick crack you get when a small animal steps on deadfall. These were heavier sounds, like something large was moving through the underbrush just outside the clearing, and they seemed to be coming from different directions. First from the north side of the camp, then from the east, then back to the west. My dad noticed it too. I could tell because he kept pausing in what he was doing and tilting his head to listen, the way he did when we were hunting and he was trying to locate game by sound. Then there was the smell. It started faint, just an occasional whiff of something unpleasant that I first attributed to stagnant water or maybe a dead animal somewhere in the woods. But as the evening wore on, the smell got stronger and more persistent. It was like being downwind from a pig farm, that sharp organic stench of animal waste and wet fur mixed with something else I couldn't identify. By the time we had our fire burning steady and were starting to think about dinner, the smell was strong enough that we both commented on it. My dad joked that maybe there was a wild hog wallow nearby, and we'd just have to put up with the stench until morning. We were frying up some bacon on the camp stove. My dad always brought a big slab of bacon on camping trips because it kept well and went with everything. When I remembered that I'd left my rifle in the truck, with all the sounds we'd been hearing from the woods and being so far from any help if we needed it, I figured it would be smart to have the gun close by. Our truck was parked maybe 30 yards from the fire, just at the edge of the clearing where the sandy track came in. The walk over there meant leaving the circle of firelight and heading into darkness, but it was a short distance and I could still see the flames behind me. I was about halfway to the truck when I saw them. Two eyes, glowing yellow-green in the darkness, looking straight at me from maybe 20 feet away. At first I thought it might be a deer that had wandered into the clearing to see what we were up to. The height seemed about right. The eyes were roughly level with mine, and I was standing on a little mound of gravel that the construction crews had dumped there, which put me up about 3 feet higher than the surrounding ground. But as I stood there staring at those eyes, my brain started processing other details that didn't fit with any animal I knew about. The eyes were too widely spaced for a deer, and they had an intelligence in them that was unsettling. They weren't the blank, reflective stare you get from most night animals caught in artificial light. These eyes were focused, aware, studying me as much as I was studying them, and they were attached to something much larger than any deer. As my vision adjusted to the darkness, I began to make out the shape of whatever was standing there watching me. It was upright, completely upright on two legs, not the hunched posture of a bear or the forward-leaning stance of a large cat. The shoulders were massive, much broader than a human's, and the whole torso had a thickness that suggested incredible physical strength. But it was the face that really got to me. Even in the poor light, I could see that the features were more human than animal. The forehead was heavy and protruding, but the overall structure reminded me more of a person than a bear or ape. The hair was sparse and long, hanging in stringy patches that looked almost like an orangutan's, but coarser and less organized. The thing, and I knew by then that it definitely wasn't any normal animal, just stood there looking at me. Not aggressive, not threatening, just observing, like it was trying to figure out what I was and what I was doing there. My hand went automatically to where my pistol would have been if I'd been wearing it, but of course the gun was back at the camp with my dad. For what felt like several minutes but was probably only a few seconds, we just stared at each other across that patch of sandy ground. Then I heard my dad calling my name from back at the fire. The sound of his voice seemed to break whatever spell had been holding me frozen in place. I backed away from the creature slowly, not wanting to make any sudden movements, but also not wanting to turn my back on it. It didn't follow me or make any threatening gestures, just continued to stand there watching as I retreated toward the firelight. When I got back to camp, my dad took one look at my face and asked what was wrong. I told him about the eyes, about the shape I'd seen standing in the darkness, about how big it was and how human-like the face had appeared. He grabbed his rifle and a flashlight, and we both headed back toward where I'd encountered the creature. But by the time we got there, it was gone. The flashlight beam revealed nothing but empty clearing and the edge of the woods beyond. That's when my dad suggested we move our camp up to the second floor of one of the cabins. The cabin frames were 2 stories, with the upper level designed to be a sleeping loft. There were no stairs installed yet, just a ladder made of 2x4s nailed between the floor joists. But the height would give us a better view of the surrounding area and make us feel less vulnerable if anything decided to come visiting during the night. We moved our gear up to the second level and settled in to wait for whatever might happen next. The opening where the front door would eventually go gave us a clear view of our campfire and most of the clearing beyond. We didn't have to wait long. Maybe an hour after we'd gotten settled in the cabin, I saw movement at the edge of the firelight. At first it was just a shadow that seemed to separate itself from the darkness at the tree line. But then the creature stepped fully into the illuminated area around our fire, and I got my first clear look at the thing that had been watching me earlier. It was enormous, even allowing for the fact that we were looking down at it from the second floor. I could tell it was well over 8 feet tall, probably closer to 9. The proportions were all wrong for a human. The arms were too long, the torso too broad, the head too large. But the way it moved was unmistakably intelligent, purposeful. It walked straight to where we'd been frying the bacon, moving with complete confidence like it owned the place, and we were just temporary visitors. The fire was still burning, and our camp stove was still sitting there with the pan we'd been using to cook dinner. What happened next is something I'll never forget as long as I live. The creature bent down, not crouched, just leaned forward slightly at the waist and picked up the entire slab of bacon we'd left on the stove. It didn't grab at it frantically like a wild animal going after food. It just reached down with one massive hand and lifted the bacon away from the pan with the casual ease of someone picking up a newspaper. Then it straightened up and looked directly at our cabin. Even from 50 feet away and 20 feet up, I could see its face clearly in the firelight. The features were primitive, but definitely more human than animal. Heavy brow ridge, flat nose, wide mouth. The expression was calm, almost curious, like it was studying us as much as we were studying it. It held the bacon in one hand and continued to stare up at our hiding place for maybe 30 seconds. Then, without any sign of hurry or fear, it turned and walked back toward the tree line, disappearing into the darkness as smoothly as it had appeared. My dad and I sat there in that half-finished cabin for the rest of the night, taking turns keeping watch, while the other one tried to get some sleep. Neither of us got much rest. Every sound from the woods, and there were plenty of them, had us both instantly alert and scanning the clearing with our flashlights. The most terrifying realization, the one that kept me awake long after my dad had started snoring, was how easily that thing could have gotten to us if it had wanted to. The cabin had no doors, no windows, nothing but empty openings where the construction crew would eventually install proper barriers. If the creature had decided it wanted more than just our bacon, there was absolutely nothing that would have stopped it from walking right into either cabin and taking whatever it wanted. But it hadn't. It had taken the food and left us alone, almost like it was following some kind of rules or code that we didn't understand. When morning finally came, we climbed down from the cabin and examined the area around our campsite. The sandy ground near the fire pit should have shown clear footprints from something that large and heavy, but there were no tracks at all. It was like the thing weighed nothing or knew exactly how to step to avoid leaving marks. The only evidence of our visitor was the missing bacon and a lingering trace of that pig farm smell in the air. We packed up our gear and drove back to town that morning, telling the boss that we'd need to come back with a full crew to finish the job safely. We never did go back. The boss found another contractor to complete the cabins, and I never asked how that worked out. 50 years later, I still think about that night. I've read everything I could find about similar encounters in the Everglades, and I know we weren't the only ones to see something like that out there. But most people who talk about it focus on the creature itself, how big it was, what it looked like, whether it was aggressive or peaceful. What haunts me is the intelligence I saw in its behavior. The way it moved with complete confidence through our camp. The casual way it took what it wanted, the direct eye contact it made before leaving. It wasn't just some unknown animal that wandered into our clearing looking for food. It was something that understood exactly what it was doing, something that had probably been watching us work all day before deciding to make its move. Something that could have killed us both without breaking a sweat, but chose not to. And that might still be out there, somewhere in those woods, making the same choice about other people who venture too far into its territory. Story 9. I've been hunting wild hogs in South Florida for over 20 years, and I thought I'd seen everything those swamps could throw at me. Gators, panthers, snakes thick as your arm, wild boars that could gut you before you knew what hit you. But what I encountered that day in the sawgrass fields near Naples changed everything I thought I knew about what lives out there in those remote cypress heads. This was maybe 5 or 6 years ago, early December, during what should have been prime hog hunting season. The weather had been dry for weeks, which meant the hogs were concentrating around the few reliable water sources deep in the preserve. I'd gotten permission to hunt a section of private land that bordered the Big Cypress, an area where the landowner had been having problems with feral pigs tearing up his cattle pastures. The terrain in that area is typical South Florida. Open fields of sawgrass broken up by these dense stands of cypress trees that locals call bayheads. The bayheads are where the water collects, forming these dark, wet pockets of forest that stay green and lush even during the dry season. That's where the hogs like to bed down during the heat of the day, coming out into the open grassland at dawn and dusk to feed. I'd been working this particular field for about 2 hours, moving slowly along the edge, where the sawgrass met a large bayhead on the eastern side. The morning was cool and clear, with just enough breeze to keep the bugs down and cover any small sounds I might make. Perfect hunting conditions. I was carrying my 12-gauge Remington, loaded with double-aught buck, enough firepower to drop a 300-pound boar if I placed the shot right. I'd taken dozens of hogs with that gun over the years, and I was confident I could handle whatever came out of those cypress trees. The field I was hunting was maybe 2 acres of open sawgrass, bordered by bayheads on 3 sides, and a dirt access road on the 4th. The grass was about waist-high, thick enough to provide good cover for both me and any hogs that might be moving through the area. I was working my way slowly along the tree line, stopping every 20 yards or so to glass the open areas with my binoculars. That's when I saw it. At first it was just a dark shape at the very edge of the cypress stand, maybe 60 yards away from where I was positioned. My initial thought was that it was a black bear. They're not common in that area, but they do move through occasionally, especially during the dry season when they're looking for water. I dropped into a crouch automatically, bringing my shotgun up to a ready position while I tried to get a better look at whatever was moving around in the shadows at the tree line. The shape was dark, bulky, and definitely large enough to be a bear, but something about the way it was positioned bothered me. Bears, when they're feeding or investigating something, tend to move around a lot. They'll sniff and paw at things, move from spot to spot, generally be pretty active. This thing was perfectly still, like a statue sitting at the edge of the woods. I raised my binoculars and focused on the dark mass, trying to make out details through the vegetation. That's when I realized the shape wasn't just sitting still. It was crouched down, like it was hiding behind some palmetto fronds, deliberately trying not to be seen. That behavior was all wrong for a bear. Bears don't hide. They're apex predators in Florida swamps, and they don't crouch down behind bushes to avoid being noticed. If anything, a bear would be more likely to stand up on its hind legs to get a better look at me. I was still trying to figure out what I was looking at when the thing stood up. Jesus Christ, I'll never forget that moment as long as I live. When it rose to its full height, I realized immediately that this wasn't a bear. The proportions were all wrong. The movement was too fluid, too controlled. Bears don't stand up with that kind of balanced, deliberate motion. This thing unfolded itself from its crouched position, like it was a person who had been kneeling down and was now getting back to its feet, smooth, coordinated, purposeful. And when it reached its full height, I could see it was enormous. I'm pretty good at estimating distances and sizes. You have to be when you're hunting. And this thing had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe closer to 8. The body was massively built, with shoulders that looked like they belonged on a linebacker, and arms that were clearly too long for any human proportions. But it was the way it moved that really got my attention. When it stood up, it didn't lumber like a bear would. It rose with this fluid, athletic movement that was unmistakably bipedal, unmistakably intelligent. Then it turned to face me directly. I don't know how it knew I was there. I was 60 yards away, crouched down in tall grass, wearing full camouflage, and I hadn't made any noise that I was aware of. But when that thing turned toward my position, its gaze went straight to where I was hiding, like it had known exactly where I was the whole time. Those 10 seconds of eye contact felt like an eternity. Even at that distance, I could see its face clearly through my binoculars. It wasn't human, but it wasn't animal either. The features were heavy, primitive, with a pronounced brow ridge and a broad, flat nose. But the eyes were the worst part. They had this intelligence in them, this awareness that was absolutely terrifying. It wasn't looking at me the way an animal looks at a potential threat. It was studying me, evaluating me, making decisions about what I represented and what it should do about my presence. The fur covering its body was thick and coarse, ranging from dark brown on the torso to almost black on the arms and legs. The chest area looked more human than ape-like, but the proportions were all wrong. Too broad, too muscular, like someone had taken a human torso and scaled it up by 50%. But what really scared me wasn't how it looked, it was how I felt looking at it. I was holding a 12-gauge shotgun loaded with enough firepower to stop a charging bear, and I felt completely helpless. That gun in my hands might as well have been a stick for all the confidence it gave me. Something about the way this thing carried itself, the casual way it had stood up and turned to face me, made it clear that my weapon wasn't going to be much of a factor if things went bad. We stared at each other across that field of sawgrass for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 seconds. I didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't even blink. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to either shoot or run, but I couldn't make myself do either. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the thing turned its back on me and walked into the bayhead. Not hurried, not alarmed, not showing any sign that it considered me a threat worth worrying about. It just calmly turned around and disappeared into the dense vegetation of the cypress stand, moving with that same fluid, controlled motion I'd seen when it stood up. The most unsettling part was how quiet it was. I've tracked wounded hogs through thick brush, and I know how much noise a large animal makes when it's moving through dense vegetation. This thing, which had to weigh at least 400 or 500 pounds, disappeared into that bayhead without so much as a rustle of leaves. I stayed frozen in that crouch for probably another 5 minutes, staring at the spot where it had vanished, waiting for some sign of movement or sound that would tell me where it had gone. But the bayhead had just swallowed it up completely, like it had never existed. Finally, I managed to get control of my breathing and start thinking rationally again. My hands were shaking so bad, I could barely hold the shotgun steady, and my heart was pounding like I'd just run a marathon. But I knew I had to investigate the area where I'd seen it, if only to prove to myself that the whole thing hadn't been some kind of hallucination. I worked my way slowly across the sawgrass field, keeping my gun ready and checking every shadow and thicket as I moved. It took me maybe 10 minutes to cover the 60 yards to where the thing had been standing, and with every step I took, I expected it to come charging out of the trees at me. But when I reached the spot, there was nothing there except flattened grass and the most god-awful smell I'd ever encountered. The smell hit me like a physical blow the moment I got within 20 feet of the tree line. It was this combination of sour body odor and heavy musk that made my eyes water and my stomach turn. Like a wet dog that had been rolling in garbage, mixed with something sharper and more acidic that burned the inside of my nose. The grass, in a roughly circular area, maybe 8 feet across, had been pressed flat, like something heavy had been lying there for an extended period. But the strange thing was that despite the obvious weight and size of whatever had made that impression, there were no clear footprints in the surrounding area. The ground around the bayhead was mostly sand and organic matter that should have shown tracks clearly, but I couldn't find a single clear print. It was like the thing had been careful to step only on vegetation or roots, avoiding any surface that would hold a clear impression. I stood there at the edge of that flattened grass, breathing that horrible smell and staring into the wall of vegetation where the thing had disappeared. And that's when the real terror hit me, not the fear of what I'd seen. That was unsettling but manageable. The terror came from the realization of what would have happened if I'd followed it into that bayhead. That dense stand of cypress trees was maybe 50 yards across, with visibility limited to just a few feet in any direction. If I'd gone in there after the thing I'd seen, I would have been operating blind, stumbling through thick vegetation and standing water, while something that knew that terrain intimately was watching my every move. In that moment, standing at the edge of the trees with that nauseating smell filling my nostrils, I understood with absolute clarity that if I entered that dark, tangled maze of cypress and palmetto, I wouldn't be hunting anymore. I'd be the one being hunted. The thing I'd seen hadn't run away from me. It had simply withdrawn to terrain where it had every advantage, terrain where a human with a shotgun would be nearly helpless. If it had wanted to eliminate me as a threat, all it had to do was wait for me to follow it into that bayhead, then circle around behind me and finish the job at close range. The fact that it hadn't attacked me in the open field wasn't because it was afraid of my gun. It was because it didn't consider me enough of a threat to bother with. It had evaluated me, decided I wasn't worth the effort, and simply removed itself from the situation. That level of intelligence, of tactical thinking, was more frightening than any physical description I could give. I backed away from the tree line slowly, keeping my eyes on the dark spaces between the cypress trunks, half expecting to see movement or catch a glimpse of something watching me. But the bayhead remained still and quiet, giving no sign of what might be lurking just a few yards inside that green wall. I made it back to my truck without incident, but the drive home was a blur. I kept checking my mirrors, kept scanning the tree lines along the road, kept expecting to see something large and upright moving through the forest parallel to the highway. That was 6 years ago, and I haven't been back to hunt hogs in that area since. I've tried going to other locations, other preserves, but every time I'm alone in thick cover, I find myself thinking about that morning in the sawgrass field. I keep remembering the way that thing had looked at me, the casual confidence it had shown when it turned its back and walked away. Like it knew something about the balance of power in that situation that I was just beginning to understand. And I keep thinking about that smell, that sour, musky odor that had lingered in the air long after the creature had disappeared. Because sometimes, when I'm out in the woods now, I catch just a hint of that same smell on the breeze. When that happens, I pack up my gear and head home immediately, because I know that somewhere out there, in the dark heart of those cypress bayheads, something is still waiting, something that remembers me as clearly as I remember it. Story 10. I was 19 years old when this happened, and it's been over 15 years now, but I still can't go swimming in any natural body of water without my heart rate spiking. People think I'm being dramatic when I refuse to go to the lake or the river, but they don't understand what it's like to know that something can just emerge from the water in broad daylight and almost get its hands on you. This was in Springfield, Oregon, summer of 2008. I'd just bought my first teardrop camper, one of those tiny little travel trailers that's basically just a bed on wheels with a small kitchen setup in the back. I'd been saving up for it since I turned 18, working part-time jobs and putting away every dollar I could. The plan was to spend the summer camping all over Oregon and Washington, really getting to know the outdoors. Fall Creek Trail was supposed to be my maiden voyage with the new camper, I'd done some research online and found this spot about 20 miles east of Springfield, right along Fall Creek, where you could camp for free as long as you stayed in the designated areas. The reviews said it was beautiful, secluded, perfect for someone who wanted to get away from crowds and noise. I'd driven out there on a Friday afternoon, pulled into this little clearing right next to the creek, and spent the evening getting familiar with the camper setup. Everything worked perfectly. The propane stove, the water pump, even the little fan that was supposed to keep you cool at night. I felt like I'd made the smartest purchase of my life. Saturday morning was gorgeous. Clear blue sky, temperature already climbing toward 80 degrees by 9 a.m., with this perfect breeze coming off the mountains. I made coffee on the camp stove, ate some breakfast, and just sat there feeling proud of myself for pulling off this whole camping adventure. By noon, it was getting seriously hot. The sun was beating down on the clearing where I'd parked, and even with the camper's windows open and that little fan running, it was like sitting in an oven. I could hear the creek running just 30 yards away, and the sound of all that cool water was driving me crazy. I'd brought swimming trunks, but looking at the creek, I realized I probably didn't need them. The nearest campsite was at least a quarter mile away, and I hadn't seen another person since I'd arrived the day before. The water looked clean and inviting, maybe 4 feet deep in the middle with a nice sandy bottom. So I stripped down to my underwear, grabbed a towel, and walked down to the water. The creek at that spot was maybe 20 yards across, with a gentle current that wasn't strong enough to be dangerous, but kept the water moving and fresh. On my side, there was a nice gradual slope into the water, perfect for wading in slowly. The opposite bank was steeper, with some overhanging trees that created good shade. I waded out until the water was up to my chest, then just stood there for a few minutes, letting the cold creek water cool me down. It felt incredible after sitting in that hot camper all morning. I was thinking about how smart I was to pick this spot, how perfect the whole setup was, when I noticed movement on the far bank. At first I thought it was just a branch moving in the breeze, but then I realized someone was sitting in the shade over there, long dark hair hanging down, kind of hunched over, wearing what looked like a brown shirt or maybe just a really tan. My first thought was that it was some hippie who'd been camping up the creek and had come down to the water to cool off, just like I had. I was a little annoyed, to be honest. I'd picked this spot specifically because it seemed isolated, and now I had a neighbor. But I figured live and let live. The creek was big enough for both of us. Then the person stood up and started walking into the water. Even from across the creek, I could tell something was off about the way they moved. Too fluid, too comfortable in the water, like they spent more time in creeks than on dry land. And they were tall, really tall. When they got waist deep in the water, their torso was still completely visible, which meant they had to be close to 7 feet. That's when they started swimming toward me. Not a normal swimming stroke, but this weird frog kick motion where they stayed mostly underwater with just their head and shoulders visible. And they were fast, way faster than any person should be able to move through water. As they got closer, I started to make out more details. And that's when I realized this definitely wasn't a hippie or a camper or any other normal person. The hair was wrong. Too coarse, too thick, hanging in matted chunks like it had never been washed or brushed. The face was wrong too, though I couldn't quite see the features clearly with all that hair hanging down, and the shoulders were too broad, the arms too long. But the smell, Jesus Christ, the smell. When they got to maybe 10 feet away from me, this odor hit me like a physical wall. It was the worst thing I'd ever smelled in my life, and I grew up on a farm where I dealt with every kind of animal waste and rotting organic matter you can imagine. This was different. It was like someone had taken the smell of a wet dog, mixed it with garbage that had been sitting in the sun for weeks, added some kind of sharp chemical stench that burned your nostrils, and then made it 10 times stronger. The smell was so overwhelming that I actually gagged and stumbled backward in the water. That's when I got a clear look at the face swimming toward me, and I realized I was in serious trouble. It wasn't human. The features were all wrong, too heavy, too primitive. The eyes were completely black, like horse eyes but bigger, and they were focused on me with this intelligence that was absolutely terrifying. The mouth was slightly open, and I could see teeth that were too large and too sharp for any person. I started swimming back toward my side of the creek as fast as I could, but I'm not a great swimmer under the best circumstances, and panic was making me clumsy and inefficient. I could hear splashing behind me, getting closer, and then I could hear breathing, heavy, labored breathing like someone who'd been running hard. The breathing was right behind me, maybe 3 feet behind me. I was maybe 5 feet from the bank when I felt something brush against my leg. Not a branch or a piece of debris, something warm and deliberate that moved like a hand trying to grab my calf. That touch sent a jolt of pure terror through my entire body. I don't think I've ever moved so fast in my life. I lunged forward, got my hands on the muddy bank, and hauled myself out of the water using just my arms, not even trying to get my feet under me. I rolled onto the shore, jumped up, grabbed my shorts from where I'd left them, and ran for the camper. I didn't look back until I was inside my truck with the doors locked. I sat there for maybe 2 minutes, catching my breath and trying to process what had just happened. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it, and my hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip the steering wheel. Finally, I worked up the courage to peek over the dashboard and look back toward the creek. She was standing on my side of the bank now, maybe 15 feet from where I'd climbed out, and I could see her clearly. She was huge, at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. Her entire body was covered in this thick, reddish-brown hair that looked coarse and matted, like it had never been groomed. The hair was longer in some places than others, hanging in stringy clumps from her arms and legs. The thing that really got to me was how human-like her torso was. She had breasts that hung down like an old woman's, but they were covered in the same coarse hair as the rest of her body. Her posture was completely upright, balanced, not the hunched-over stance you'd expect from an ape or a bear. But her face was the most disturbing part. It was pale, almost white, like porcelain or bone. The features were heavy and primitive. Big jaw, broad nose, heavy brow ridge. But those eyes were what really scared me. They were completely black, no visible whites at all, and they were scanning the area where I'd climbed out of the water with this methodical intelligence. She was looking for me. She knew I was somewhere close, and she was trying to figure out where I'd gone. I ducked back down below the level of the windows and stayed there for what felt like hours, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes. When I finally got the courage to look again, she was gone, just vanished without a sound. 1 minute she was standing there searching for me, and the next minute the creek bank was empty. I hadn't heard her walk away, hadn't heard any splashing from the water, hadn't heard anything at all. I stayed locked in that truck for another hour, just sitting there and shaking, trying to convince myself that the whole thing had been some kind of hallucination, brought on by too much sun and not enough water. But I knew that wasn't true. The smell was still in my nostrils, and I could still feel the memory of that hand brushing against my leg. Finally, I got up the nerve to get out of the truck and pack up the camper. I threw everything together as fast as I could, not caring about organization or doing it right, just wanting to get out of there as quickly as possible. The whole time I was packing, I kept looking over my shoulder toward the creek, expecting to see her standing there watching me. The drive back to Springfield was a blur. I kept checking my mirrors, kept imagining I could smell that horrible odor seeping into the truck somehow. When I got back to town, I drove straight to the nearest gas station and sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, just being around other people and trying to feel normal again. I never went back to Fall Creek Trail. Hell, I barely used that teardrop camper again at all. I'd planned to spend the whole summer camping, but after what happened at the creek, the idea of being alone in the wilderness terrified me. I'd been planning a camping trip with my girlfriend for the following weekend, somewhere up in the Cascades. I cancelled it, made up some excuse about work or family obligations. I couldn't tell her the truth. Who would believe a story like that? And honestly, I couldn't handle the thought of being responsible for someone else's safety if something like that happened again. The worst part wasn't the immediate terror of the encounter. It was how it changed everything about being outdoors for me. Before that day, camping and hiking had been pure joy, a way to get away from the stress of work and city life. The wilderness had been this beautiful, peaceful place where I could recharge and feel connected to nature. After the creek, I couldn't look at any natural area the same way. Every time I saw a lake or river, I found myself wondering what might be living in it, what might be watching from the other side. Every shadow in the trees looked like it could be hiding something. Every unusual sound in the forest made me freeze and listen for breathing or footsteps. Even now, 15 years later, I can't fully relax when I'm outdoors. I still go hiking sometimes, but never alone and never near water. I've learned to enjoy nature again, but there's always this underlying awareness that we're not the only intelligent things living in these wild places. The thing that haunts me the most is how close she got. If I'd been a weaker swimmer, if I'd panicked and gone under for even a few seconds, if I hadn't felt that hand on my leg and gotten that burst of adrenaline, I don't know what would have happened. But I know she was fast enough to catch me if she'd really wanted to. I know she was strong enough to pull me under without much effort. And I know she followed me right up to the bank, close enough to reach out and grab me as I was climbing out. The fact that I escaped wasn't because I was faster or smarter or luckier. It was because she let me go. For whatever reason, she decided not to finish what she'd started. And that's what keeps me awake at night sometimes, wondering why she let me live and whether she's still out there, waiting in some other creek or lake for the next person to decide to cool off on a hot summer day. Story 11. I was 15 years old when this happened, and it's been over 20 years now, but I still can't walk through any kind of tree plantation without getting that same cold feeling in my gut. My family had moved to Naples, Florida when I was 12, but we used to spend summers up in the Pacific Northwest, where my dad grew up. That particular summer, I was staying with my uncle who had a small place near what's now called Lake Point. Back then, the whole area was different. Less developed, more rural, with these massive Christmas tree farms stretching for miles in every direction. My uncle's property bordered two of the biggest farms, one that had been established for decades with these huge mature trees, and another that was newer with smaller, younger plantings that were only 2 or 3 years old. I'd been fishing that morning at a small pond about 2 miles from my uncle's house, and I was walking back through the tree farms because it was the shortest route home. I had my Rottweiler with me, this big, fearless female named Sasha who went everywhere I went. She was probably 90 pounds of pure muscle, and I'd never seen her back down from anything. Not other dogs, not wild animals, not even people she didn't trust. The path I was taking wound between the 2 farms, following this old dirt road that the farm equipment used to move between different sections of trees. On my left were the young trees, maybe 6 feet tall, planted in perfect rows about 8 feet apart. On my right were the older trees, some of them 15 or 20 feet high, thick and dense enough that you couldn't see very far into the plantation. It was late afternoon, maybe 4 or 5 o'clock, and the light was starting to get that golden quality you get in summer when the sun is getting lower, but it's still warm. Perfect weather, really. Not too hot, a slight breeze, the kind of day where you're happy to be outside and in no hurry to get home. I was walking along, thinking about the fish I'd caught and whether my uncle would want to cook them for dinner, when Sasha suddenly stopped dead in her tracks. She'd been trotting along beside me, tongue hanging out, looking around at everything the way dogs do, but all of a sudden she just froze, her whole body going rigid, and I could see the hair on the back of her neck starting to stand up. I stopped too and looked around, trying to figure out what had gotten her attention. At first I didn't see anything unusual, just rows and rows of Christmas trees stretching out in both directions, the dirt road continuing ahead of us toward my uncle's house. Nothing moving except the slight swaying of branches in the breeze. Then I saw it. Way off in the distance, maybe 300 or 400 yards away, there was something moving through the rows of young trees on my left. At first it was just this brown shape that seemed to be gliding between the trees, but it was moving in a way that didn't match any animal I knew about. It wasn't the quick, erratic movement of a deer or the lumbering gait of a bear. This thing was moving with purpose in a straight line, and it was covering ground fast without seeming to hurry. I squinted, trying to get a better look at whatever it was. The young trees provided some concealment, but they weren't dense enough to completely hide something that size. And whatever it was definitely large. Probably as tall as the 6-foot trees, maybe taller. That's when Sasha started whimpering. This was a dog who had chased off cougars and never shown fear of anything in her life. But she was pressing herself against my leg, making these low, worried sounds in her throat, and her whole body was trembling. I reached down and put my hand on her head, trying to comfort her, but she just pressed closer to me. Her fur was completely standing on end now, not just on her neck, but all down her back. The brown shape in the distance was getting closer, moving from tree row to tree row with this fluid motion that was hypnotic and terrifying at the same time. It would disappear behind one row of trees, then reappear in the gap between rows, then disappear again. But it was always moving toward the dirt road, toward where we were standing. I should have turned around and gone back the way we'd come, or cut through the older trees to my right to get away from whatever was approaching. But I was 15 and curious and stupid, and I wanted to see what it was. As it got closer, maybe 100 yards away now, I could see more details that made my stomach start to knot up with fear. Whatever this thing was, it was moving upright. Not on all fours like a bear, not with the bounding gait of a deer, but walking or running on 2 legs like a person. But the proportions were all wrong for a human. Too tall, too broad, moving with a coordination that seemed impossible. The color was what really stuck with me. It looked like a grizzly bear's fur, that rich brown color with lighter patches mixed in. But the hair was longer and shaggier, hanging in clumps that swayed as it moved. It was maybe 50 yards away when I realized it was going to cross the dirt road right where we were standing. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like they were made of concrete. Sasha was practically vibrating against my leg now, whimpering constantly but not barking or growling. She was scared, really scared. And that scared me more than anything else. The thing reached the edge of the young tree plantation and paused for just a second at the tree line, maybe 20 yards from the road. For that brief moment, I got a clear look at it, and my brain just refused to process what I was seeing. It was standing completely upright, probably 6 feet tall, maybe a little more. The body was massively built, with shoulders that looked like they belonged on a linebacker. The arms were long, longer than human arms, and they hung at its sides as it stood there. But it was the way it moved next that really got to me. In 4 steps, just 4 steps, it crossed the 20 yards between the tree line and the dirt road. Not running, not leaping, just this smooth, flowing movement that covered ground like it was walking on air instead of solid earth. It crossed the road maybe 20 feet in front of us, moving from left to right, heading toward the mature trees on the other side. When it passed closest to us, I could see its profile clearly. And that's when I knew for certain that this wasn't any animal I'd learned about in school. The head was shaped wrong, too large and too human-like for any bear or ape I'd ever seen pictures of. The face was mostly hidden by all that long, shaggy hair, but I could see enough to know that the features underneath were intelligent, aware, and it was completely silent. No sound of footsteps on the dirt road, no breathing, no rustling of clothing or equipment. It moved across that open space without making any noise at all, like it was a ghost or a shadow instead of something physical. When it reached the other side of the road, it disappeared into the mature Christmas trees with the same fluid motion, sliding between the thick trunks like water flowing around rocks. I kept watching, expecting to hear the crash of branches breaking or the sound of something large pushing through dense vegetation, but there was nothing, just silence. And not normal forest silence. This was the kind of absolute quiet that happens when every living thing in the area stops what it's doing and holds its breath. No birds, no insects, no small animals moving through the underbrush. Even the breeze seemed to die down. The entire forest was holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. I stood there on that dirt road for maybe 5 minutes, waiting for some sound from the mature trees that would tell me where the thing had gone. But the silence just stretched on and on, broken only by Sasha's occasional whimper. Finally, I realized we needed to get out of there. Whatever I'd just seen, wherever it had gone, I didn't want to be standing in the open when it decided to come back. But instead of continuing forward on the road toward my uncle's house, I turned around and went back the way we'd come. Something about the way that thing had moved, the intelligence I'd seen in its posture and gait, told me that taking the direct route home might not be the smartest idea. Sasha didn't argue with that decision. She stayed pressed against my leg the entire walk back, looking over her shoulder constantly, never relaxing until we were well away from the Christmas tree farms and back on paved roads with houses and normal suburban sounds. When I got to my uncle's house, I tried to tell him what I'd seen. But even as the words were coming out of my mouth, I could see the skeptical expression on his face. A 15-year-old kid claiming to see some kind of creature moving through the tree farms. It sounded like exactly the kind of story a teenager would make up for attention. He listened politely, asked a few questions about where exactly I'd been and what time it happened, but I could tell he thought I'd either seen a bear from a distance and let my imagination run wild, or made the whole thing up. The only one who believed me was Sasha. For weeks afterward, she refused to go anywhere near those Christmas tree farms. If we were walking on roads that led in that direction, she would plant her feet and refuse to move forward, no matter how much I coaxed or pulled on her leash. And she'd developed this new behavior where she would constantly scan the tree line when we were outdoors, her head moving back and forth like she was watching for something. She never fully relaxed again during the rest of that summer. I started paying more attention to her reactions when we were out walking. If she suddenly got tense or started that low whimpering, I'd look around more carefully, trying to see what had triggered her alarm. Most of the time I couldn't spot anything unusual, but I learned to trust her instincts. Dogs know things we don't. They can smell things we can't detect, hear sounds outside our range, pick up on subtle changes in the environment that our human senses miss completely. Sasha had known something was wrong long before I'd spotted that brown shape moving through the trees. She'd known we were being watched, being evaluated, being approached by something that didn't belong in any nature documentary or biology textbook. The thing that bothers me most about that day isn't what I saw, though that was disturbing enough. It's what I didn't see. I never saw it actually enter the mature trees. 1 second it was crossing the road in front of us, and the next second it was gone, swallowed up by the forest like it had never existed. No sound of impact, no breaking branches, no disturbance of the vegetation. It moved through that landscape like it had been doing it for years, like it knew every tree and every shadow and every safe path through the woods, like it belonged there more than we did. And the silence that followed its disappearance, that wasn't natural either. That was the kind of silence that happens when a predator moves through an area and every other living thing knows to stay hidden until the danger passes. 20 years later, I still think about that afternoon sometimes. usually when I'm in any kind of forest or wooded area, especially if I'm alone. I find myself scanning the shadows between trees, looking for movement that doesn't quite fit the normal patterns of wind and wildlife. I never saw it again, but I never forgot the feeling of watching something that powerful and intelligent move through the world with such complete confidence. Something that could cross open ground in 4 silent steps and disappear into dense forest without leaving a trace. Something that my dog knew was dangerous long before I had any idea we were in trouble. And something that, based on Sasha's reaction, is probably still out there somewhere, gliding through forests and tree farms, covering impossible distances without making a sound, watching and waiting and choosing when to show itself to the occasional human who happens to be in the wrong place at the right time. Story 12. My name is Dan, and I've been an outdoor education instructor for over 20 years. I've taken thousands of kids on field trips to state parks, nature preserves, and wilderness areas across the Midwest. In all that time, I thought I'd seen everything: kids falling into creeks, bee stings, panic attacks, you name it. But what happened at Garden of the Gods in the Shawnee National Forest is something I've never been able to explain, and it's the reason I don't take groups to that particular location anymore. This was maybe 8 years ago, late spring. I had a group of 11-year-olds from a school in Carbondale, Illinois, 22 kids total, plus 2 parent chaperones and myself. We were doing a day-long environmental education program, talking about rock formations, forest ecology, basic geology, that kind of stuff. Garden of the Gods is this beautiful area in the Shawnee National Forest, famous for these incredible sandstone rock formations that create these natural overlooks and bluffs. The main trail takes you to observation points, where you can look out over miles of forest canopy, and there are these dramatic cliff faces that drop down maybe 60 or 70 feet to the valley below. We'd been hiking for about 2 hours, stopping at different points along the trail to talk about the local ecosystem, identify plants, discuss how the rock formations were created over millions of years. Standard field trip stuff. The kids were engaged, asking good questions, and everything was going exactly as planned. We reached the main observation point around 11 in the morning. It's this wide, flat area of exposed sandstone that gives you a spectacular view of the forest stretching out in all directions. Below the overlook, maybe 60 feet down, there's a small stream that winds through the valley, with thick trees on both sides. I'd brought the group to this spot to talk about erosion and how water shapes the landscape over time. I was explaining how the stream below had helped carve out the valley we were looking down into, pointing out how the water had cut through different rock layers. That's when one of the kids started shouting about something moving in the water. I turned to see where he was pointing, and at first, I didn't see anything unusual. The stream was maybe 15 feet wide at that point, flowing over rocks and creating these little pools and eddies. But then I spotted movement in one of the deeper pools, maybe 40 yards downstream from where we were standing. At first, I thought it was just someone swimming or wading in the creek. The Shawnee gets visitors year-round, and it wouldn't be unusual to see hikers cooling off in the water on a warm spring day. But as I focused on the movement, I realized there were multiple figures down there, and something about them didn't look quite right. I pulled out my binoculars. I always carry them on field trips for wildlife observation, and got a clearer look at what was happening below us. There were 3 figures in and around that pool of water. 2 of them were larger, maybe adult-sized, with this cinnamon-colored hair covering their entire bodies. The hair was long and thick, almost shaggy, and it was clearly visible even from our distance above them. The 3rd figure was smaller, darker in color, more like a dark brown or black. At first I thought it might be a child with the 2 adults, but the proportions were all wrong. The head was too large, the arms too long, the overall build too heavy for any human child, and they were moving wrong. Not the awkward splashing movement you'd expect from people wading in a creek, but with this fluid, natural motion, like they were completely at home in the water. By this point, several of the kids had noticed what I was looking at, and they were crowding up to the edge of the overlook, trying to get a better view. I should have moved them back immediately, should have distracted them with something else, but I was too caught up in trying to figure out what I was seeing. That's when the vocalizations started. One of the larger figures, I couldn't tell which one from that distance, began making sounds that carried clearly up to our position on the cliff. At first, they sounded like random grunts or calls, the kind of thing you might hear from any large animal. But as I listened more carefully, I realized there were patterns, variations in tone and length that suggested something more complex. It wasn't just noise, it was communication. The sounds had this clicking quality, almost like someone clicking their tongue against their teeth, but deeper and more resonant. Mixed in with that were these whistles, and what I can only describe as tonal variations, like someone speaking in a language that used pitch changes to convey meaning. The really unsettling part was that the other figures were responding, not just echoing the same sounds, but making different vocalizations that seemed to be answers or replies. They were having a conversation down there, using sounds that were unlike anything I'd ever heard from any animal. I lowered my binoculars and looked around at the group of kids. They'd all gone completely quiet, which is unusual for 11-year-olds in any situation, but they were listening to those sounds with this fascinated attention, like they instinctively understood that they were hearing something important, something unusual. One of the parent chaperones moved up beside me and whispered, "What are those things?" I didn't have an answer for her. I'd been working in outdoor education for 15 years at that point, and I'd never seen or heard anything like what was happening in that creek below us. That's when the smaller, darker figure started moving toward the bank. It came out of the water in one smooth motion, not the awkward scrambling you'd expect from someone climbing out of a creek, but with this athletic coordination that was both human-like and completely wrong at the same time. When it reached the rocky bank, it turned toward our overlook and looked directly up at us. Even from 60 feet away, I could see its face clearly. It was darker than the others, with features that were more primitive, more ape-like, but the expression in its eyes was unmistakably intelligent, aware. It was looking at our group of children with what I can only describe as curiosity. Several of the kids gasped when they realized it was looking at them. A few of them waved, like they were greeting someone they'd met on a nature walk, but I could see in their body language that they were nervous, unsettled, even if they couldn't articulate why. That's when one of the larger figures noticed what the smaller one was doing. It emerged from the water with that same fluid motion, but there was something different about its posture, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It moved with purpose, with what looked like protective instinct. It positioned itself between the smaller figure and our overlook, and then it did something I'll never forget as long as I live. It looked directly up at our group and let out a scream. Not a roar, not a howl, not anything you'd expect from a wild animal. This was a high-pitched, piercing scream that carried incredible emotional intensity. It was angry, protective, and absolutely terrifying. The sound hit our group like a physical blow. Several of the kids immediately started crying. Others grabbed onto me or the parent chaperones, and a few actually moved back from the edge of the overlook like they were afraid whatever was down there might somehow reach them. The scream went on for maybe 5 seconds, but it felt like much longer. When it finally ended, the forest around us had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, no wind through the trees. Just absolute quiet that felt heavy and ominous. I knew immediately that we needed to leave. Whatever was happening down there, however harmless it might or might not be, I had 22 children to think about, and my primary responsibility was keeping them safe. I moved quickly to gather the group, speaking in what I hoped was a calm, reassuring voice. I told them we were going to head back to the parking area, that we'd seen some interesting wildlife, but it was time to move on to the next part of our field trip. But as I was organizing the kids and trying to get them moving back down the trail, I couldn't resist one more look through my binoculars. All three figures were out of the water now, standing on the rocky bank. They were looking up at us, and I got the distinct impression that they were waiting to see what we would do. Not threatening exactly, but definitely watching, evaluating. The two larger figures were positioned protectively on either side of the smaller one, like parents flanking a child. Their posture was alert, but not aggressive, like they were ready to respond to whatever happened next, but weren't looking for a confrontation. But their eyes never left our group. I lowered the binoculars and focused on getting the children organized for the hike back. As we started moving down the trail, several of the kids kept looking back over their shoulders, asking questions about what we'd seen, wanting to know if we could go back for another look. I told them we'd talk about it when we got back to the bus, but privately, I was hoping they'd get distracted by something else and forget about the whole incident. I didn't want to deal with the phone calls from parents, the questions from school administrators, the inevitable media attention if word got out that I'd taken a group of elementary school kids to observe unknown creatures in a state forest. The hike back to the parking area was tense for me. Though the kids seemed to recover their normal energy pretty quickly, I kept expecting to hear more of those vocalizations echoing through the forest, or to catch a glimpse of movement in the trees around us. But everything remained normal, quiet, just a regular walk through the woods. It wasn't until we were loading the kids back onto the bus that one of the parent chaperones pulled me aside and asked what I thought we'd actually seen down there. I told her I wasn't sure, that it might have been people in costumes or maybe some kind of performance art piece. But even as I was saying it, I knew that wasn't true. The movements had been too natural, too coordinated. The vocalizations had been too complex, too much like actual communication, and that scream, that hadn't been human. No person could have produced a sound with that much emotional intensity, that much raw, protective fury. On the bus ride back to school, I found myself thinking about the smaller figure, the way it had looked up at our group with what seemed like innocent curiosity. And I thought about how quickly the larger figures had moved to protect it when they realized we were watching. That suggested family structure, social organization, parental instinct, all things that pointed to intelligence much higher than any known animal species. But it also suggested that we'd been intruding on something private, something that wasn't meant for human observation. That scream hadn't been random aggression. It had been a clear message telling us to back off, to leave them alone. When we got back to school, I filed my standard post-trip report with the administration, but I left out any mention of what we'd encountered at the overlook. I described it as a successful day of environmental education with good student engagement and no incidents. Over the next few weeks, I kept expecting to hear from parents whose children had gone home with stories about the strange creatures they'd seen in the forest. But as far as I know, none of the kids ever talked about it. Maybe they'd convinced themselves it had been people playing in the creek, or maybe they'd just forgotten about it in the way kids do, or maybe, on some instinctive level, they understood that what they'd witnessed was something that should be kept private. I never took another group to Garden of the Gods. I told my supervisors that I thought the overlook was too dangerous for elementary school kids, that the drop-off was too steep and the safety barriers inadequate. All of which was true, but that wasn't the real reason. The real reason was that I didn't want to risk another encounter where I'd be responsible for the safety of children while dealing with something I couldn't understand or control. Because I knew with absolute certainty that what we'd seen that day wasn't human. And I knew that if we'd done anything to threaten or alarm those figures, especially the smaller one, the situation could have escalated in ways I wasn't prepared to handle. 8 years later, I still think about that morning at Garden of the Gods. I still wonder what those three figures were doing in that creek, what they were communicating about, where they went after we left. And I still remember that scream, the raw emotion in it, the clear message it conveyed. We were intruders in their world, and they were letting us know, politely but firmly, that our presence wasn't welcome. The fact that they let us leave safely, that they didn't follow us or try to intimidate us further, suggests a level of restraint and intelligence that's both reassuring and terrifying, because it means they made a conscious decision to let us go. And that implies they could have just as easily made a different choice. Story 13. My name is Glenn, and I live on a ranch between Graham and Jacksboro in North Texas. I've been dealing with something on my property for the past few years that I can't explain, and it's gotten to the point where I don't sleep well at night anymore. What I'm about to tell you happened maybe 3 years ago, but it was just the beginning of something that's been escalating ever since. I'd gotten interested in the whole Bigfoot research thing after watching some shows on TV and reading forums online. I know how that sounds. Middle-aged rancher gets obsessed with monster hunting. But there'd been stories in Jack County for decades about strange sightings and unexplained incidents. Enough that I figured there might be something to it. So I'd started going out with a group of other guys who were into the same thing. We called it squatching, which I guess is what the community calls looking for Bigfoot. We'd drive the back roads at night with night vision equipment, thermal cameras, audio recorders, that kind of stuff. Most of the time we didn't find anything, but it was fun to get out and explore areas of the county I'd never seen before. This particular night, we'd decided to check out some dirt roads around Mountain, which is this tiny community in Jack County about 20 minutes from my place. The area is perfect squatching territory, thick woods, creek systems, not much human activity after dark. If something large and intelligent was living in North Texas and trying to avoid people, that's exactly where it would hang out. There were 4 of us in 2 trucks, driving slowly along these narrow dirt roads that wind through ranch land and patches of forest. I was in my pickup with my night vision monocular, scanning the tree lines and open fields as we moved through the area. The night vision equipment was something I'd invested in after getting serious about this whole thing. It wasn't military grade or anything fancy, but it was good enough to pick out details in complete darkness that you'd never see with the naked eye. I'd practiced with it enough that I was comfortable using it while we were driving, scanning back and forth across the landscape, looking for anything unusual. We'd been out for maybe 2 hours, covering probably 15 miles of back roads, when we came to this spot where the road runs along the edge of a large pasture. On one side was open grassland, stretching maybe a quarter mile to a line of trees, and on the other side was thick forest that came right up to the roadway. I was scanning across the pasture with the night vision when I spotted something dark near the tree line on the far side of the field. Through the monocular, it looked like a dark mass, roughly circular, sitting motionless in the grass, maybe 300 yards from the road. My first thought was that it was a cow or a calf that had bedded down for the night. The size looked about right, and cattle do lie down in fields, especially during cooler weather, but something about the shape bothered me. It was too perfectly round, too uniform, not quite the right silhouette for a cow at rest. I had the driver pull over so I could get a better look. I adjusted the infrared sensitivity on the monocular, trying to get clearer definition on whatever I was looking at. The moment I made that adjustment, everything changed. The dark mass stood up, not the way a cow gets up with that awkward front legs first motion they use. This thing rose in one smooth, fluid movement, going from a compressed circular shape to fully upright in what seemed like a single motion. And when it reached its full height, I could see it was enormous. Through the night vision, it looked like it had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe more. The proportions were all wrong for any animal I knew. too tall, too broad across the shoulders, standing perfectly upright on two legs. The moment it stood up, it turned to face our direction. I don't know if it could see our trucks parked on the road, or if it had heard the engines, but it seemed to know exactly where we were. For maybe 2 seconds, it stood there looking toward us, and I got this clear view of its silhouette through the monocular. Then it turned 90 degrees to the left and walked into the forest. I've never seen anything move like that in my life. It covered the distance from where it had been sitting to the tree line, maybe 30 yards, in 3 steps. Not running, not leaping, just these impossibly long fluid strides that ate up ground like it was walking on air. By the time it disappeared into the trees, I was fumbling with the video function on the night vision device, trying to get some kind of recording of what I'd just witnessed. But in my excitement and confusion, I hit the wrong button and turned the whole unit off instead of starting the camera. When I got it powered back up and focused on the tree line where the thing had disappeared, there was nothing there, just empty pasture and the dark wall of forest beyond, like it had never existed. I tried to explain to the other guys what I'd seen, but even as I was describing it, I could hear how crazy it sounded. A 7-foot-tall creature that could cross 30 yards in 3 steps and vanish into the woods without a sound. It sounded like something out of a comic book, but I knew what I'd seen. The way it had moved wasn't natural, wasn't possible for any normal animal. Athletes don't move like that. Machines don't move like that. Nothing I'd ever observed in nature moved with that kind of fluid, effortless coordination. We spent another hour in the area, scanning with different equipment, playing recorded Bigfoot calls, trying to get some kind of response or additional sighting. But everything remained quiet and normal. Whatever I'd encountered had either moved far away or was staying well hidden. When I got home that night, I was still wired from what had happened. I stayed up until almost dawn, going through Bigfoot forums online, looking for similar sighting reports, trying to find some explanation for what I'd witnessed. That's when the really disturbing stuff started. 2 days later, I was doing some maintenance work around the house when I noticed something odd in the soft dirt behind my back porch. There were footprints, large footprints that definitely weren't mine or from anyone else who lived on the property. These weren't boot prints or shoe prints. They were bare foot impressions, but scaled up to an impossible size. I got out a tape measure and found they were almost 16 inches long and about 8 inches wide. The stride length was over 6 feet between prints, but the most unsettling thing was how close they came to the house. The tracks started at my back door, literally 8 feet from where I sleep at night, and led in a straight line toward the creek that runs along the back edge of my property. I followed the trail as far as I could, but it disappeared when it reached the rocky creek bed. Whatever had made those prints had walked right up to my house, then headed directly for the water. That was disturbing enough, but what happened a few nights later was even worse. I have a nephew who stays with me sometimes on weekends. He's maybe 10 years old, and he sleeps in the back bedroom that faces the yard where I'd found the footprints. Around 2 in the morning, he started screaming, not the normal scared kid yell you get from a nightmare, but genuine terror. I was out of bed and running toward his room before I was fully awake. When I got there, he was pressed against the far wall, pointing at the window, talking about something that had walked past outside. He was crying and shaking, and it took me several minutes to get him calm enough to tell me what he'd seen. According to him, something tall had passed by the window, moving from left to right across the yard. He said it was too tall to be a person, and it moved wrong, like it was gliding instead of walking. I grabbed a flashlight and went outside to check the area around that window. I didn't find any new footprints. The ground was too dry and hard to show tracks. But there was a smell in the air that I'd never encountered before. It wasn't quite skunk, but it had that same sharp, organic quality, mixed with something else that was harder to identify, musky, wild, like the smell of an animal that had never been around humans. The odor was strong enough that it lingered in that spot for several minutes, even with a slight breeze moving through the yard. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing a pattern to these incidents. First, there would be some kind of sound, not loud, but noticeable. A branch snapping or footsteps or something moving through the brush near the house. Then the smell would appear, that same wild, musky odor I'd detected the night my nephew saw something at the window. After the smell, there would be a period of movement. Not visible movement, but you could sense something repositioning, changing location, circling around the property. And through all of this, there was this constant feeling of being watched, of something intelligent, studying the house and the people inside it. The pattern was too consistent to be random. This wasn't swamp gas or natural odors from the creek. This was something deliberately moving around my property, something that was curious about me and my family, but smart enough to stay mostly hidden. I started keeping a log of these incidents, noting the times and locations where I detected signs of activity. What I found was that whatever was visiting my ranch was getting bolder, coming closer to the house, staying around for longer periods. The night vision sighting near mountain had been just the beginning. Something had followed me home that night, or maybe it had already known where I lived, and the sighting had just been its way of announcing its presence. I tried setting up trail cameras around the property, hoping to get photographic evidence of whatever was prowling around my ranch. But every camera I put out either malfunctioned, got knocked over by wind, or simply disappeared entirely. After losing 3 expensive game cameras in 2 weeks, I gave up on that approach. The psychological pressure of living with this constant sense of being observed was starting to wear on me. I found myself checking locks multiple times before bed, getting up several times during the night to look out windows, jumping at sounds that I'd never paid attention to before. My sleep got worse and worse. Even when exhaustion finally took over and I managed to fall asleep, I'd wake up with the feeling that something had been watching me while I was unconscious. Not a dream or a nightmare, just this certainty that I'd been studied while I was vulnerable. The worst part was the intelligence behind it all. Random animal behavior doesn't follow patterns like this. Wild creatures don't systematically scout human dwellings, don't test security measures, don't seem to make deliberate decisions about when to reveal themselves and when to stay hidden. Whatever was visiting my ranch was smart enough to avoid my cameras, patient enough to observe my routines, and bold enough to come right up to my house in the middle of the night. That combination of traits is more disturbing than any physical description I could give. 3 months after the initial sighting, I was lying in bed around midnight when I heard footsteps on my back porch. Not the normal sounds of an animal moving around, deliberate measured footsteps, like someone walking slowly across wooden boards. I got up and moved quietly to the back door, listening to whatever was out there. The footsteps continued for maybe 30 seconds, moving from one end of the porch to the other, then stopping directly outside the door where I was standing. For several minutes, I stood there in my kitchen, separated from whatever was on my porch by maybe 6 inches of wood and glass. I could hear breathing, slow, deep breaths that were definitely not human, but not quite animal either. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped, the presence disappeared, and everything went back to normal. No footsteps walking away, no sounds of movement through the yard. Whatever had been on my porch just vanished, as silently as it had appeared. That was the night I realized I was dealing with something that had moved far beyond simple curiosity. This thing had established some kind of relationship with my property, some kind of routine that included regular visits and increasingly bold behavior. I still live on that ranch, and the activity continues. Some nights are quiet, normal. Other nights, I'll catch that familiar smell drifting through my windows, or hear sounds that don't belong to any animal I can identify. The footprints still appear occasionally, always leading from the house toward the creek, always too large to belong to any human. And sometimes, when I'm working outside during the day, I get that feeling of being watched from the tree line. I don't go squatching with my friends anymore. I found what I was looking for, or maybe it found me. Either way, I know now that there are things living in the forests of North Texas that science hasn't catalogued yet. Things that are intelligent enough to study us, patient enough to watch and wait, and bold enough to walk right up to our houses when they decide we're worth investigating. The terror isn't in what I might see someday. The terror is in knowing that I'm already being seen every single night by something that understands me much better than I understand it. Story 14. I moved away from that area over 10 years ago, but I still drive past Dwarf Mountain sometimes when I'm visiting family, and seeing all those condominiums built up the side of what used to be wilderness just makes my stomach turn. Not because I'm against development. That's just progress, I guess. But because I know what was living up there before they cleared the trees and poured all that concrete. This happened in late February, maybe 15 years ago now. I was living in a little house about 2 miles from the base of Dwarf Mountain, back when it was still mostly forest and hiking trails, instead of the sprawling residential development it is today. I had this Doberman named Kara. Beautiful dog, smart as hell, and protective without being aggressive. She was my constant companion, went everywhere with me. Kara and I hiked those mountain trails probably 4 or 5 times a week. It was our routine. I'd get home from work, change clothes, and we'd head up the mountain for an hour or 2 of exercise. She loved it up there, always full of energy, investigating every smell and sound, chasing after squirrels and chipmunks, but never actually catching anything. That particular day was grey and overcast, one of those late winter afternoons where the sky looks like it's pressing down on everything. We'd had a warm spell the week before that melted most of the snow, but there were still patches of old, crusty snow and ice in the shaded areas where the sun didn't reach. I remember checking the weather before we left, and it looked like we might get some rain later that evening, but nothing that would interfere with our hike. The temperature was probably in the mid-40s, cold enough that you needed a jacket, but not so cold that it was uncomfortable to be outside. We took our usual trail that started at the base of the mountain and wound up through mixed forest toward what locals called the crest, a ridgeline that gave you a decent view of the valley below and the surrounding hills. It was maybe a 3-mile round trip, perfect for an evening workout. Kara was in a good mood that day, trotting along beside me with her ears perked up, stopping occasionally to sniff at things that caught her attention. Normal dog behavior, nothing unusual. The trail was mostly clear, just a few icy patches here and there that I had to watch out for. We'd been hiking for maybe 20 minutes, gaining elevation steadily, when we came to this section where the trail runs along a small creek. The creek was mostly frozen over, with just a trickle of water running underneath the ice in some places. That's where I saw them. At first, I thought someone had been playing a prank. There were these huge footprint impressions in a patch of old, dirty snow next to the creek, and they looked so cartoonishly large that my first reaction was to laugh. I figured some kids had made fake feet out of cardboard or plywood and gone stomping around in the snow, trying to make people think they'd found Bigfoot tracks or something. But when I got closer to examine them, the laughter died in my throat. These weren't cardboard cutouts pressed into snow. These were real impressions, with depth and detail that you can't fake. I could see individual toe marks, the arch of the foot, the heel impression. The edges were clean and well-defined, like they'd been made in soft mud and then frozen solid. I pulled out my phone to take some pictures, but before I did that, I wanted to get a sense of scale. I wear a size 10.5 boot, which is pretty average for a guy my height. I placed my boot next to one of the prints for comparison. My boot looked like a child's shoe next to that footprint. The print was easily twice as long as my boot and probably half again as wide. When I tried to estimate the size, I figured it had to be at least 16 or 17 inches long and maybe 8 inches wide. That would make it bigger than any human foot I'd ever seen, bigger than any animal track I was familiar with. But the really disturbing thing was that there wasn't just one print. There was a trail of them, leading from the creek bank up toward the ridgeline. And there were two distinct sets of tracks, one set of the giant prints I'd been looking at, and a second set that was smaller, but still much larger than human-sized. The two trails ran parallel to each other, maybe 4 feet apart, like two individuals had been walking side by side through the forest. Both sets of tracks were heading in the same direction, up the mountain toward an area where the forest got thicker and the hiking trails petered out. I was still crouched down next to the tracks, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, when Kara suddenly went rigid beside me. She'd been sniffing around the area while I examined the footprints, just doing her normal dog investigation routine. But all of a sudden, she locked onto something, her whole body going tense and focused in a way I'd only seen when she was tracking deer. Without any warning, she took off into the forest like a shot, following what must have been a scent trail leading away from the footprints. She disappeared into the thick underbrush so quickly that I barely saw which direction she'd gone. This was completely out of character for her. Kara was a well-trained dog who always stayed close to me on hikes. She might chase a squirrel for 30 or 40 yards, but she'd never just vanished into the woods like that, and the way she'd taken off, nose to the ground, completely focused, ignoring everything else. That was exactly how she behaved when she'd picked up the scent of deer. I started calling for her, but my voice seemed muffled and small in the thick forest. The trees were dense enough in that area that sound didn't carry very far, and I couldn't tell which direction she'd gone once she got out of sight. I waited there by the footprints for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, calling her name and listening for any sound that would tell me where she was. The silence was oppressive, unnatural. No birds, no small animals moving through the underbrush, no wind through the trees, just dead quiet. Then I heard her coming back, crashing through the underbrush much more noisily than she'd left. When she emerged from the trees, I could immediately see that something had changed. Her whole demeanor was different, tense, alert, with the hair along her back standing up in a way that meant she was either scared or preparing for a confrontation. She came straight to me and pressed against my leg, which was something she did when she was nervous or uncertain. But she kept looking back toward the forest where she'd been, and I could see her nose working constantly, like she was still processing whatever scent she'd been following. That's when the real fear hit me. It wasn't fear of what I'd seen. The footprints were weird and unexplainable, but they were just impressions in old snow. The fear came from realizing that whatever had made those tracks was recent enough, fresh enough, that my dog could still smell it and track it. Those weren't fossil footprints or old marks left over from weeks ago. Something had walked through that area recently, maybe hours ago, maybe less. And it was large enough to leave tracks bigger than anything I'd ever seen. And it had been right here, maybe 2 miles from my house, in an area where I walked my dog several times a week. I grabbed Kara's leash and clipped it to her collar, something I usually didn't bother with on our regular hiking route. But her behavior had me spooked, and I wanted to make sure she didn't take off again into the woods after whatever she'd been tracking. We headed back down the mountain much faster than we'd come up. Kara stayed close to me the entire time, constantly looking over her shoulder and occasionally whimpering in a way that suggested she was still processing what she'd encountered in the forest. When we got home, I spent the evening online looking up information about large animal tracks, trying to find some explanation for what I'd seen. I looked at bear paw prints, which can be pretty large, but the shape was all wrong. I looked at human footprints, but the size was impossible for any person. Everything I found just reinforced my initial impression that those tracks didn't belong to any animal I was familiar with. I decided I needed to go back the next day with a camera and get proper documentation of what I'd found. Maybe I could follow the trail further, see where it led, get a better sense of what had made those impressions. But when I went back the following afternoon, everything had changed. It had rained hard overnight, and the combination of rain and slightly warmer temperatures had washed away most of the remaining snow. The area where I'd seen the footprints was just muddy ground and wet leaves, with no trace of the impressions that had been so clear the day before. I spent over an hour searching the area, trying to relocate the exact spot where the tracks had been, but without the snow as a reference point, everything looked different. The forest that had seemed so familiar during hundreds of previous hikes now felt foreign and confusing. I never found those tracks again, but I never forgot the feeling I'd had standing there next to them, the realization that something unknown and impossibly large had been walking through that forest just hours before I arrived. Something that my dog had been able to track by scent, something that had made her nervous and alert in a way I'd never seen before. Over the next few months, I paid closer attention during our hikes, looking for any other signs of unusual activity in the area. I never found additional footprints, but I started noticing other things that seemed out of place. Branches broken at heights that would require something very tall to reach them. Areas where the underbrush looked disturbed, like something large had pushed through. Trees with bark scraped off at eye level for someone who would have to be 8 or 9 feet tall. Kara's behavior changed too. She never again showed the same relaxed, playful attitude she'd had on our previous hikes. She was always alert, always scanning the forest, always ready to bolt back toward the trail at the first sign of anything unusual. About a year later, the development company bought the land and started clearing trees for the condominium project. Watching the bulldozers tear down forest that had been standing for decades was heartbreaking, but part of me was also relieved. If something had been living up there, something large and intelligent enough to leave tracks like the ones I'd found, the construction would have forced it to move on to wilder areas, further from human development. But sometimes, when I'm driving past those condominiums, I wonder if the residents know what used to walk through their neighborhoods before the houses were built. I wonder if anyone else ever found tracks like the ones I saw, or if I was just lucky enough to be in the right place at the right time to stumble across evidence of something that preferred to remain hidden. The worst part isn't not knowing what made those footprints. The worst part is knowing that it was there, just 2 miles from where I lived, walking through forests where I took my dog for exercise every week. How many times had Kara and I hiked right past something that was watching us from the trees? How many times had we walked along trails that some unknown creature had used just hours before? The idea that we share the landscape with intelligent beings that we don't understand, beings that are smart enough to avoid detection most of the time, is more unsettling than any specific threat they might represent. Because it means the world is bigger and stranger and more mysterious than we like to admit. And it means that even in places that feel familiar and safe, we might not be alone. Story 15. I was 16 years old when this happened, and I'm 31 now. But I still can't ride a motorcycle without my heart rate spiking every time I go around a blind corner in the woods. People think I'm being dramatic when I won't ride trails alone anymore. But they don't understand what it's like to know that something was waiting for you in the forest, something that understood exactly when and where you'd be vulnerable. This was in the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York, on my family's property about 20 minutes outside of Phoenicia. My dad and I had spent most of that summer building this incredible motocross trail that wound through our 40-acre lot, starting in the open field behind our house and then diving into the thick forest that covered the back half of our land. The trail was my dad's idea, but I was the one pushing to make it more challenging, more technical. We'd spent weekends cutting through underbrush, moving fallen logs, building jumps and berms, creating these tight sections that weaved between trees and required real skill to navigate at speed. The forest section was my favorite part of the whole track. It was maybe a quarter-mile of single track that snaked through dense woods with sharp turns, elevation changes, and these natural jumps where the trail crossed over fallen trees or small ravines. You had to stay completely focused in there because the trees came right up to the edge of the trail. And if you went offline even a little bit, you'd slam into a trunk or get clotheslined by a low branch. I'd been riding that trail almost every day since we'd finished it, always trying to go a little faster, shave a few seconds off my lap times, push myself to take the tight corners at higher speeds. I knew every route, every rock, every tricky section by heart. That particular afternoon was perfect for riding. Cool but not cold, bright sunshine, just enough humidity to keep the dust down, but not enough to make the trail slippery. I'd gotten home from school, changed into my riding gear, and headed out for what I figured would be a quick 30-minute session before dinner. My bike was this Yamaha 250 that my dad had bought used, and we'd rebuilt together. Nothing fancy, but it was reliable and had enough power to handle the jumps and technical sections we'd built into our trail. I'd been riding it for over a year, and it felt like an extension of my body. I could put it exactly where I wanted it without thinking about it. I'd done maybe 3 or 4 laps already, getting warmed up, hitting my rhythm, when I decided to really push it on what would be my last run before heading back to the house. I was feeling confident, loose, riding better than I had all summer. The forest section started with this fast-flowing S-curve that led into a series of small jumps, each one getting progressively bigger. The trick was to carry enough speed through the S-curve to clear all 3 jumps without having to use the throttle in between, which would upset your balance and line you up wrong for the tight left-hand turn that came after the 3rd jump. I nailed the S-curve perfectly, hit the first jump with exactly the right speed, and was flying through the air toward the 2nd jump when I saw it. At first, it was just movement in my peripheral vision, something that caught my attention but didn't fully register because I was focused on landing and setting up for the next jump. But as I landed and was lining up for the 3rd and biggest jump, my brain processed what I'd seen and everything changed. There was something in the trees off to my right, maybe 90 feet away between 2 rows of thick pine trees. At first glance, I thought it might be a person, maybe someone hiking on our property or a hunter who'd gotten lost. But the proportions were all wrong, and it was positioned in a way that didn't make sense for any normal person. It was too tall, too broad across the shoulders, and it was leaning forward through a gap in the trees, like it was reaching toward the trail, like it was trying to get my attention. The mouth was what really got me. It was open wide, wider than any human mouth should be able to open. And even though I couldn't hear anything over the sound of my engine, I got the distinct impression that it was making some kind of vocalization, a call or a roar, or something that was meant for me. All of this registered in the space of maybe 2 seconds, while I was in the air over the 2nd jump, committed to a trajectory that would take me over the 3rd jump and into the tight left turn. But those 2 seconds felt like an eternity. Like time had slowed down to let me process every detail of what I was seeing. The thing, and I knew immediately that it wasn't human, was covered in hair or fur that was so dark it was almost black, like charcoal or soot. The arms were too long, hanging down below where human arms should end, and the hands looked massive even from that distance. But it was the face that really terrified me, broad and flat, with features that were heavy and primitive, and these eyes that were set deep under a pronounced brow ridge. The eyes were tracking my movement, following the arc of my jump like whatever this thing was. It was completely focused on me. I hit the 3rd jump going faster than I ever had before, partly because I was in shock, and partly because some instinct was telling me that speed was my only option. As I launched into the air, I could see the creature more clearly, and that's when I realized how close it actually was to the trail. It wasn't 90 feet away, it was maybe 30 yards, close enough that if it wanted to, it could probably reach the trail in a few quick steps. And the way it was positioned, leaning forward through that gap in the trees, suggested that it was thinking about doing exactly that. In the split second I was in the air over that jump, I had to make a decision that would probably determine whether I lived or died. My first instinct was to hit the brakes as soon as I landed, to slow down and try to figure out what I was dealing with. But some deeper survival instinct overrode that impulse and told me that stopping was the worst thing I could do. Instead, I hit the throttle. The moment my wheels touched the ground, I pinned the gas and committed to carrying as much speed as possible through the tight turn and the rest of the forest section. If something was about to come after me, I wanted to be moving too fast for it to catch me. As I accelerated toward the turn, I could see the creature's reaction to my decision. Instead of standing up straighter or moving toward the trail, it did something that made my blood run cold. Its head pulled back into its shoulders like a turtle retracting into its shell. Not the normal movement of someone turning away or ducking back behind cover, but this unnatural, controlled retraction that happened too smoothly, too deliberately. But the eyes never stopped tracking me. Even as the head was pulling back, those deep-set eyes stayed locked on my position, following my movement with an intelligence that was absolutely terrifying. I was maybe 20 feet away from it when I realized that it was going to jump. I don't know how I knew that. Maybe something about its posture, or the way it had shifted its weight, or just some primitive instinct that recognized predatory behavior. But I was suddenly certain that this thing was about to launch itself at me, the way a mountain lion will jump at a cyclist or a motorcyclist from an ambush position. The terror that hit me in that moment was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't just fear. It was this absolute certainty that I was about to be killed, that I'd made the wrong choice by accelerating instead of braking, that I was riding straight into an ambush that would end my life. I closed my eyes. I know that sounds stupid, closing your eyes while riding a motorcycle at high speed through a forest, but it was pure instinct. The same way you might close your eyes if someone was about to throw something at your face. I couldn't handle seeing whatever was about to happen. The next thing I remember clearly was bursting out of the forest section into the open field where we'd built the start-finish area of the track. I was going way too fast. My heart was hammering in my chest, and my hands were shaking so bad I could barely maintain control of the bike. I don't remember the tight turn. I don't remember the last quarter mile of forest trail. I don't remember accelerating through whatever had been waiting for me in those trees. There's just this gap in my memory, maybe 3 or 4 seconds, where my brain apparently decided it was better not to record what was happening. But I remember the aftermath with crystal clarity. I rode straight to the garage and shut off the bike, but I couldn't get off it immediately because my legs were shaking too badly to support my weight. I sat there for maybe 10 minutes, trying to process what had just happened, trying to convince myself that I'd imagined the whole thing. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. The image of that creature was burned into my memory. The coal-black fur, the oversized hands, the broad, flat face with those deep-set eyes that had tracked my movement with such focused intelligence, and that unnatural way its head had retracted into its shoulders like it was preparing to strike. When I finally went into the house, I tried to tell my dad what had happened. But even as the words were coming out of my mouth, I could see the skeptical expression on his face. A 16-year-old claiming to see some kind of monster in the woods while riding his motorcycle at high speed. It sounded like exactly the kind of story a teenager would make up for attention. He listened politely, asked a few questions about where exactly I'd seen it and what it had looked like, but I could tell he thought I'd either imagined it or seen a bear from a distance and let my adrenaline turn it into something more dramatic. But over the next few weeks, I couldn't let it go. The feeling that I'd left something unfinished, that I owed it to myself to go back and face whatever I'd encountered, was eating at me. My dad and I ended up installing 3 trail cameras along that section of the track, positioned to cover the area where I thought I'd seen the creature. We checked them religiously for months, downloading the memory cards every few days and going through hundreds of photos of empty forest. The cameras never captured anything unusual. No large animals, no movement that couldn't be explained by wind or small wildlife, no evidence that anything out of the ordinary was living in or passing through that section of woods. But that didn't change what I'd seen. I kept riding the trail, but I never again felt comfortable in that forest section. Every time I approached the area where I'd had the encounter, my heart rate would spike and my grip would tighten on the handlebars. I'd find myself scanning the trees, looking for movement, expecting to see that dark shape reaching toward me through the gap in the pines. The worst part wasn't the fear, though. The worst part was the knowledge that I'd run away from something without understanding what it was or what it wanted. That feeling of unfinished business has stayed with me for 15 years now. Sometimes I think about going back to that spot, on foot instead of on the bike, with better equipment and more time to investigate. But every time I seriously consider it, I remember those eyes tracking my movement, remember that head retracting into those massive shoulders, and I know I don't have the courage to face that again. Because part of me is afraid that it's still there, waiting in that same gap between the pine trees, patient and intelligent and perfectly positioned to intercept anyone who comes riding through that forest section at high speed. And part of me is afraid that if I go back, this time I won't be fast enough to get away. The trail cameras are long gone now, and my family sold that property 5 years ago. But sometimes, when I'm riding on other trails in other forests, I catch myself scanning the tree line, looking for dark shapes that don't belong, listening for sounds that might indicate something large and intelligent moving parallel to my position. Because I know now that there are things living in our forests that we don't understand, things that are smart enough to position themselves at exactly the right spot to intercept a motorcycle traveling at high speed through a predictable route. Things that watch and wait and make calculated decisions about when to reveal themselves and when to let their prey escape. I got lucky that day in the Catskills, but I've never been sure whether that was because I made the right choice by accelerating, or because whatever was waiting for me in those trees decided, for reasons I'll never understand, to let me go.